Summoner's Rift. "30 seconds until minions spawn."
The Joe Rogan Experience.
Train by day, Joe Rogan podcast by night, all day.
All right, Charlie. First of all, thanks for being here.
My pleasure.
Very
Thanks
nice to
for
meet
having
you. Why do you do the things that you do?
First question is the hardest one. I guess over the years have formed a whole bunch of different answers to that, some of them flippant and sarcastic.
Minions have spawned.
Without rambling on for ages and ages, I suppose it comes down to I'm just really curious. I want to get to these places, see people living lives differently to mine. I grew up in a tiny little village where it's nice, nothing happened.
Where'd you grow up?
Just close to Salisbury in the southwest of England, about 10 miles from Stonehenge.
Oh, wow.
And yeah, I suppose I started traveling when I was about 18, took a year out between school and university, and just got more and more curious and slowly realised that I enjoyed travelling more if I was getting to places by, I suppose, and that particularly helps. I suppose you turn up in some remote community in a, not that I've been doing this, but in a helicopter or 4x4 or whatever, there's instantly a distance sort of divide. I spend most of my time in the world where that's just sort of a barrier. Whereas if you turn up on foot or in a little kayak, take to that level.
What was your first trip that you did?
Backpacking in Africa. The first time I sort of particularly visited was I flew to Beijing and I had a flight out of. Well, there's 1,000 miles between the two. I'll take a bicycle. Didn't get off to the best start. I went to a friend's 21st birthday evening, and I don't really remember the party, but when I wake up in the morning, one of my quadriceps, not torn, but the doctor said that typically. And then on my first night in Beijing, I fell over and broke my wrist. So 2 weeks later, I my task and pedaled out. I wasn't in the best shape, and frankly, the following.
Torn calf, quadriceps muscle, fucked up wrist. Just went anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I started. I'm not an athlete. I never really particularly trained for anything. I tend to try and keep fit, but that's kind of. Slowly built up. It only took 2 weeks to cross up to Ulaanbaatar, the capital of Mongolia. And once I crossed the border into Mongolia, then desert and there's kind of tire tracks. There and sort of stick with it. And frankly, those 2 weeks were kind of shitty. I didn't particularly enjoy them. But I mean, you're aware of the concept of type 2 fun. You've done it once. Then once you finish, you start to twist into it.
Right.
And before I'd even left, there could be something in this. And I saw the potential of bicycle travel. You can travel a fair distance. If you want, you can go 100 miles a day. Travel very cheaply. You get to do all this. Ready to go near if you're on a train or a car, whatever it is.
Did you have any idea of where food would be, how you would get through these areas? Did you know what towns were available?
When you that first ride, I had a map. That besides I guess a 250-mile gap in the Gobi, enough to get resupplies.
So you just had to go 250 miles through the Gobi Desert.
But you can carry
a torn quad and a fucked up wrist.
Yeah, in short. But you can carry quite a lot. You can carry, if necessary, in later years, you can carry 2, 3, 4 weeks of food pretty easily. It's not going to be very exciting. It's going to be just a lot of rice and noodles. But you can sort of stack it up.
Did you plan ahead for that? Did you understand what your requirements are going to be? Did you write it all out? I'm going to be there for hours. I'm going to need Y amount of calories.
No, I've never been good at planning. Well, no, that's not true. That's not fair. I've never loved getting granular with planning. When I'm planning food for, earlier this year, I had to plan food for about a month. And looked at times that a bunch of times. That's about as much. And then just plan 20%. Should be all right. Which is perhaps a slightly scattergun response for the approach, but I've slowly got a bit better at knowing what's needed. I mean, I've never got numbers. I don't think that people who I generally thought, I don't need to work out that I've got protein for any given day or fat fats or carbohydrates, whatever it is. Because usually when it's a long endeavor, a few months you can go with a slightly imbalanced diet, maybe take some multivitamins.
I would imagine that you're burning a lot of calories riding that bike through the desert for 250 miles.
Yeah. I mean, like, I do think that I'm not one of these people.
Slain an enemy.
But it was for me. It was revelatory because I just got this idea of what bike travel, and it was only a couple of weeks less, probably 10 days after I finished, that I got a bit drunk and made on a Genghis Khan vodka, and made quite a rash decision to cycle for what ended up being about 4 years.
Genghis Khan Booker? What are you saying?
Vodka.
Oh, Genghis Khan vodka.
Sorry. Yeah.
Okay, no worries.
I've got a plummy accent.
No worries.
Yeah, and I made this decision to cycle from the UK back to the UK via the furthest away point in each of Europe, Asia, and Africa, and that ended up taking about 4 months.
So you do this first trip, and you decide after it's completed that you get this interesting feeling. It was fun, it was exciting, it was adventurous, and that this is something you're going to do often. Are you writing about these things? Are you making videos? Like, what are you doing once you're done?
I write. I'm not a videographer. I take photos. I didn't for the 4 years that followed. I didn't have social media at that time. So I very much focused on writing. And every day, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter how sort of sweaty and uncomfortable I might be in a tent or cold or whatever, I will write down what happened that day and just get it all down. And later you can then kind of get back into that frame of mind. All these other details are quite helpful, sort of key to unlocking other memories. But writing is my main focus.
How do you fund these trips?
Initially, I was scrimping and saving, and first time earning for 4.5 years, as it turned out, on about £12,000, which back then would have been, I guess, $16,000.
For 4 years?
Yeah. So I lived in a tent. I ate very cheaply. Occasionally, I'll get a night in a hostel or something. You can live for a really small amount of money if you're just out in the wild. More recently, I get sponsorship or grants that sort of help and cover expenses. But I've always done things in quite a lo-fi way. I've never done hugely complicated or expensive journeys. I've always quite enjoyed the accessibility of doing stuff that anyone logistically probably could do.
The 4-year one, like, how does one go about deciding that you're going to do something that's going to take 4 years of your life? Like, did you recognize that it was going to take that long? Like,
I reckoned it would take about that, and rationally was the answer. I kind of, I came up with the idea before I really gave it a lot of thought. And the first thing I did is told a bunch of people, family included, hey, in a year's time, I'm going to head off on a bike for about 4 years. And once I told a bunch of people, then it became almost a certainty to me, because I think I would have been embarrassed to back down. And so I guess, I've always found that quite handy with any project. Just let people know, set yourself a start date, and then the wheels are already in motion. And out of sort of shame or embarrassment, you'll probably end up going through with it.
I can't think that anybody would fault you for quitting. I don't think anybody would say, oh, Charlie, you only did 3 years.
I came close a bunch of times. But, by the time I got 3 years, then it's like, well, I might as well.
And when you get to the end of that, did you write a book? Did you?
No, I have something for you.
Oh, there you go.
Bear with me. So what have we got here? These are, I believe, for you, Joe.
Oh, thank you.
Those 2 books are about that 4-year bike
There
ride.
you go.
And I've got a couple for Jamie.
And now, once you do this, so you get back, and I would imagine, like, writing down everything at the end of the day, I'm sure helps. But it's got to be difficult to sort of capture the nuances of each experience. If you're writing for 4 years, I would imagine there's a lot of very notable experiences you have during this time. Like, how are you remembering all these and documenting?
It's like photos help as well. Over the course of 15,000 photographs, that helps furnish a picture. But it's really just what I said. About 16 days journey. Sometimes they're very brief,
And you're just writing it down, paper?
In a bunch of tatty old notebooks that I've got kind of falling apart on a shelf somewhere.
And what was the path?
So I started near Salisbury, where I grew up, headed across the Channel, up Western Europe through Scandinavia to Nordkap, which is the northernmost point of Europe. It's up in the Norwegian Arctic. That's quite a dramatic place. The sort of monument at Nordkap is at the top of a 300-meter high, 300-yard high cliff. You go and look over the railing, and you've got the Arctic Ocean sort of crashing against it. The North Pole's another 1,200 miles on. Then I took a sort of very long, wiggly path across Eurasia to Singapore, which took 9-10 months or so.
Jesus Christ!
But I didn't know what route I was going to be taking for that. I didn't allow myself to get too bogged down with details, and also over the course of nearly half a decade, so much changes. You know, the Arab Spring happened after I started. So the Middle East, you know, changed the geography and the geopolitics of the Middle East changed after I started. Before I got back down to that part of the world.
Is this your bike?
That is the second of two. Yeah.
Did one of them break?
So the other one, the one I started with, I got off eBay for £100 second hand. So not a great bike, you know, basic. And that one got me all the way out over that bike hadn't sold. Coincidentally, that afternoon, I was on my radio show talking about my trip, and the DJ asked me about his bike, you know, in Cape Tonians, and there in cycling, mountain biking. I think he was expecting some specs, or, you know, what I was riding. And all I could really say is, actually, I got the goal this morning. He went out to my accent, angry emails, but he said, "Oh no, that's absolutely terrible. Like, let's get this boy to a bicycle. We can get him back home." And he said, "Any of you listeners out there, you've got a bicycle. You send us a message. We'll get it to this boy." And about 6 or 7 bikes were sort of presented to me the next day. Well, I had to go around the city and collect them all up, but a couple of kids' bikes. One was an antique. One had been found in a canal. The frame of which I ended up using. So I took them all apart. And I made one bike from all the different parts. And I just, the bottom bracket kind of part between the pedals and that sort of hub. That was the only part I got from a shop. And the rest was just these decimated bikes, kind of bastardized into this one Frankenstein frame.
Well, that's actually cool.
Yeah.
And so then this bike you rode for the remainder of the journey?
Yeah, that got me 10,000 miles in 1 year back home. And then was stolen a few weeks later in London.
Was it really?
Yeah, it was basically unrideable by that point. Yeah, that's the first one. That's up in Tibet.
How long do bike tires last? Because I know you change car tires. I don't think I've ever changed a bike tire. I can imagine the rubber.
Oh, they definitely wear out.
Yeah.
I think I got through something like 20 tires. But, I mean, they last a lot longer if you don't buy a pair for $3 in a village that are made in China.
Is that what you did?
I could, you know, just got whatever I could. And I think 256, 20 or so. But, you know, there's a phrase in the UK, triggers broom. There's an old TV show called Only 50 Horses where some not too bright character gets an award from the council. He's a street sweeper for having the same broom for 17 years. And you know, after he's given the medal, he says, "No, it takes a lot of dedication to care for the broom. This broom's had 17 new handles and 25 new heads over the years," and that's kind of what the bike was like. You know, besides the frame, just about every other part was slowly swapped out as I went around.
Wow. And when you are traveling through all these places, what kind of language barriers are there? Do you understand other languages besides English?
I'm not a natural linguist. I can get by in French. That was handy in sort of Central and West Africa. I picked up and sort of worked quite hard at Russian. I got some Russian, which is the Stan, Central Asia, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, etc. That was handy.
When you say picked up, did you pick up on the fly or did you prepare?
I probably a few months before I got to that part of the world, I picked up some like audio lessons. Listened to them while I was on the road, and then I got quite good at just sort of, I guess, charade. You know, even if like China was always linguistically the hardest place, but even after I learned how to ask for an egg in a shop, I still preferred to do it the way I'd done for weeks up to that point. Just go into a shop and start clucking your wings and sort of, clucking slightly more and more manically, and then pulling out from behind me an egg and pointing at it. They go, "Oh, the foreigner wants an egg. Yeah, we'll get him some eggs."
Oh, that's hilarious.
So you can make a bit of a game of it. And of course, in lots of parts of the world, there are plenty of people who do speak good English. So I wasn't washing a great deal at this time in my life. Living in a tent, getting the odd splash wash in a puddle or a river or whatever. And so my hands, which were in front of me by the time I was most of the day. When I arrived in a new country, I'd find the first English speaker I could and ask them how to count to 10 in their language, and then I'd write on my knuckles 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 on each hand, and then on the palm, hot, cold, yes, no, good, bad, up, down, left, right, just a whole bunch of vocabulary. And that you pick it up pretty quick when it's in front of you for maybe 6 to 8 hours in a day. And when that was done, I'd wash them off and maybe learn some new words and sort of carry on. So even though I was passing through regions and didn't have all of them, I got a bit of a head start with that.
Oh wow! What's it like when you're alone for that long?
That's probably the biggest challenge. And I've definitely got better at that over the years, but when I was off on that bike trip, there were times, particularly up in Tibet, where that picture was, that the road I was following in Tibet is the western sort of approach to Tibet. And on a good day, I was there in winter, which is not ideal, it's cold. But on a good day, there'd be maybe one vehicle going in either direction. But often there'd be several days at a time with no vehicles, and there were no settlements along the way. And later on, so to get into Tibet, I didn't have permission, so I had to sort of, in the night, I cut a hole in the fence of a military base and snuck into Tibet. So beyond that point, I was having to
get into Tibet. So it's difficult to get into Tibet.
Yeah. So Tibet used to be a independent country.
Right.
A lot of protest. Most ethnic Tibetan people don't want to be part of China, but in the 50s, the People's Liberation Army marched in. And this was only a couple of years after the Beijing Olympics, and in the lead up to those, there were in Lhasa, the capital, I think it was around 3 dozen self-immolations. You're aware of that phrase?
Yeah.
Yeah, and usually
Horrific.
monks. Yeah, and for the listeners, you might not know.
Well, they
this would
probably
be-
know from the Rage Against the Machine cover.
Yeah, exactly
Yeah.
that. So people marching out in front of the soldiers or the police, pouring a tin of petrol over themselves, gasoline, lighting themselves on fire and burning to death in protest of what they see as the occupation of their country. And of course, the Chinese government doesn't want people seeing this as a scene, so they made the whole area off limits to foreigners. And basically, well, still is really, you can visit sort of limited little pockets in Lhasa, the capital, and a couple of other kind of temples in towns nearby. But to do that, you've got to be in a group with a guide and a vehicle and permits, and it's expensive, and you're just not allowed to travel by yourself with a bike. So that was the only way I could get in, was to but after that point, I was then having to hide the whole time, and to bring it back to your question, the loneliness there, I really struggled. I was up there for about 6 weeks, and probably had 2 conversations in that time. It was really hard. But now I've got a lot better at it, and I keep meaning to look this up, because there's someone. It's one of those people that's always quoted. It'll be Oscar Wilde or Mark Twain, someone like that. One said that loneliness is the paucity of the company, and solitude is the richness. And it's 2 sides of the same coin. So being by yourself can totally suck. You just kind of try and flip the perspective a bit. And it's not always possible, and it's certainly not easy. You can then sort of enjoy the space, the peace, the freedom, dignity of kind of busy life when you go back home.
It is an interesting thing about human beings that we seem to have a requirement for other people's company. I mean, we really do. Like, we do enjoy moments of solitude, like sitting on a dock, looking out at an ocean, just relaxing, maybe having a cup of coffee by yourself. But if that goes on for too long, we have like a deep feeling of longing, and a sorrow comes over us. And
Well, we're pack animals.
Yeah.
And I guess this is my evolutionary take on it. I suppose anyone over the millions of years had that instinct to want to be by themselves. Probably wouldn't so much. And
Right.
so probably would have been bred out, very selective for people who live in communities.
yeah, it makes sense. It only makes sense. But it's so strange how intense it is when you are alone for long periods of time. And for people that have never experienced that, it's what you've done in doing that is really extraordinary. And I would imagine it gives you some very unique insight into how your own mind works.
Yeah. I think I've always been relatively good in my own company. I suppose years ago I might have referred to myself as a loner in the sort of process as well.
Yeah.
But I do like my own company. I'm happy with my company, but I have got. I suppose over long periods, I would realise later I was essentially desocialised, and suddenly being back in a community or around people where I can have a conversation, it just takes a bit of time to kind of equalise after being by yourself for a long time, because you've got no one else to answer to.
Yeah.
It's total freedom, and that can be an indulgence, a self-indulgence.
I've never spent that kind of time alone, but I've spent time in the woods. And when you're by yourself for a day or two, one of the things that always hits me is you start evaluating your own life, evaluating relationships, evaluating friendships, evaluating work, various things that you don't normally think about in such great depth. But when you're alone and you don't have anyone to talk to, it's like those are the things that the mind wants to dig up and maybe examine. Did you find that?
Definitely, and it's definitely a positive thing to do. The more
Yeah.
time you've got to chew things over, the more to grips you're going to get with any problems in your life, whatever it might be. And then there's always the temptation, which I'm quite regimented with myself about how long I allow myself to listen to music or podcasts or whatever in any given day. That's the thing with your podcast when I was in, I think. And podcasts are great, but suddenly you've got company all day, and that's a way to, I suppose you'll be thinking about and learning about whatever's been spoken about, but you're not exploring things by yourself in the way that you can if you just have silence and peace. And I'm quite strict with myself. Like on my latest script, I allow myself in the morning an hour of listening to something, and then in the afternoon maybe another hour at some point, and then while cooking dinner I could listen to something like that.
How did you decide that amount of time?
It was arbitrary essentially. It just needed to be needed to
Regimented.
ensure that I wasn't doing that all the time. So it wouldn't always be exactly an hour, but maybe a podcast.
Right, yeah.
One of yours is the whole morning, of course.
Right.
But something short like that.
You went through the Congo on a bike?
I started on a bike. I was actually with someone else at this project. So this was 2014. A guy from Scotland who I'd met, he was motorbiking down the east coast of Africa with a couple of friends, and I think about 7 times we kept bumping into each other. They were covering a lot more ground. They were taking a more circuitous route than me. But in Cape Town, him and I spent a bit of time together, and he said, "Hey, we'll go, I'll fly up there." And so in the capital town, he flew up. He bought a bike for £90, like a sort of 3-gear, shitty, heavy, strong bike. And we cycled into Congo, DRC, the 2 Congos, the big one, the fucked up one, I guess. We cycled across the border in the south, in the Copper Belt, and then followed the border all the way across the south of the country until eventually the road we were following just came out. But there was a river there. We'd been aware that it was out the river. And so we bought a dugout canoe, which is a pirogue, which is essentially just a tree trunk with the inside. It's sort of typical tribal canoe that you see right across the world, South America, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Papua New Guinea, same sort of thing. We bought one that was about 5.5 meters long, I think, and the next month we kind of battled this thing down the river. But as we say, it was not in great shape. And we had to get in it, all our gear and 2 bicycles, and these things sit really low in the water, maybe 2 inches of clearance, for any small rapids of water coming in, you're going down. But after we bought it, we pulled it up onto the riverbank and we turned it upside down and we were patching some little leaks and cracks. And the whole village just gathered around us in this big, excited, concerned crowd, and they were tapping and shaking their heads. And a sort of spokesperson stepped forward and said, "Really, I don't think you should go on the river. There are rapids and waterfalls," and we're like, "Yeah, you'll be right." And there are hippos and crocodiles, and if you guys don't drown, you'll be eaten. You'll be dead in a day, either way. And we took it with a pinch of salt. And that month was probably the most fraught of my life. It was ridiculous. Every day we'd be struggling down rapids. The smallest little rapid would be enough to sink us, and the boat wouldn't sink. It would just go down. It would sit 2-3 inches under the water. But unless we had them all strapped down, all our bags would start floating off in different directions. And we're sort of splashing around in the water, trying to gather everything. Oh, that one's got the money and the cameras. Oh, get that bag. That's got all of our food. Of course, over there. And all the while, you're wondering when is the crocodile going to come grab your ankle.
Did you see them?
We only saw one.
Really?
They're around. Everyone kept saying they're around. Lots of people said they do see them. I think they've been hunted quite a lot over the years. And although these are on the Congo, so this is a tributary of the Congo River, they're Nile crocodiles, that's the species. And they grow up and they get really big.
They're 20 feet long.
I think that's about the max.
Yeah, they're huge. That's a dangerous animal.
Yeah, well, I mean, we were in a really remote area. There were no roads. No one else was speaking. People had canoes, but they would just use them for fishing. They would just sit in the water, placing out. And we one afternoon paddling along, and there was this group of maybe 50 men on the river, waving, singing, dancing around, shaking machetes above their heads. But a few hundred yards on, there was a bank, and we pulled to the left. They said, "Oh, they just killed a crocodile, a big one." And so they're 5 meters, so that's about 50 meters. It's big. One night, we'd hear the hippos hunting.
What does a hippo noise sound like?
Sort of as best I can do. But yeah, we'd hear those quite a lot at night, and we had to camp on the riverbank, but the hippos go out for walks around at night, and sometimes there'd be shoulder high elephant grass, and the only places that we could really pitch a camp would be in these channels that the hippos would tread. It was a difficult time. After a month, we finally reached a road, sort of sand-tracked, I guess, and a couple of days later, we just managed to get to a town in time for me to collapse in bed with a pretty severe case of malaria.
Oh, wow.
But I had typhoid fever at the same time, so it was like double trouble.
Oh, boy.
So I couldn't really walk for about a week. So yeah, that was a.
What did they give you to get over the malaria?
I was really lucky. We managed to get to a town, and I went to the Catholic mission where they had a nurse and said, like, "Please treat me." Archie's my friend. He'll buy the drugs, and so this nurse guy, actually whose name I shouldn't say, he gave me drips of ciprofloxacin and I think metronidazole, I think. 2 different antibiotics, just a lot. But the drips were the most frightening thing, because he didn't use he would sort of do the drip in the morning, come back in the afternoon and blow it off and then plug it in my arm.
Great. So if you don't die of malaria, you die of infection.
Yeah, it was a worrying time.
Jesus Christ. So how long did it take you to recover from the malaria?
Well, I didn't have long, because we had to get, our visas were only 3 months, and we'd already been going for so we had to get out of the country within a certain amount of time. So after, I think it was probably about 8 days, we then, I was able to walk again, but I was still super weak. We then had to go and sort of get passage on a bus, as they call it there, but this is just a truck with a metal shipping container in the back of it. And we spent about 5 days on these trucks kind of bouncing around. You either cling to the top, there's no roads, it's all just mud tracks. In the rainy season, which was kind of not far off, it would take a month to do that 5-day drive to the capital that we...
Because it'd be so much mud?
Well, yeah, the roads just churn up. The roads, the tracks that we were on were sometimes these sort of channels carved 5-6 yards deep into the mud.
Wow.
And so as soon as it starts raining, they're all completely gone. I came across so the monsoon arrived 6 weeks or so later, by which time I was up in the other Congo, way up in the north, kind of near the border of Cameroon and Central African Republic, on these mud tracks. And suddenly I just saw these trucks that had kind of run off the tracks into the trees, and there were people inside. I mean, I could carry it for about a day and a half, take everything off, carry it a mile. So it was 5 miles for every 1 mile forward, just to back.
Holy shit! How much crime did you encounter?
Not a huge amount. I mean, like, my pocket got picked in Malaysia, which is one of the safest places in the world. My horse got stolen in Mongolia. That happens.
You had a horse?
Yeah, they're not expensive.
How much is a horse?
I bought a horse for about 120 pounds. I guess.
Really?
So.
You get a horse for 150 bucks?
It depends how many. Every few years, Mongolia has. They call it a snow on ice event. So essentially, Mongolia winter is really cold. And if it snows and then thaws and then freezes, you get this crust of ice over the ground. The horses, which are kind of left alone twice over winter, they're kind of semi-feral, it's called. They're kind of half wild. They can't break through that crust of ice as they would with snow with their hooves to get to the grass. So come spring, actually last time I was in Mongolia, the whole countryside was littered with corpses of sheep, horses and goats. So if they've had a bad winter before, sometimes they lose up to about a third of their kind of national livestock. Then horses cost quite a lot, but it wasn't too bad when I was there. The horse I would sort of, at night, so I spent about 2 months hiking across Mongolia with this horse. I tried to ride it, but it was so small, tiny little pony. I'd gone to quite a lot of effort to find a horse that was up to the challenge. I went out into this village outside the capital city, asked around, and you can't do anything there without having to drink copious amounts of vodka. It's a real pain in the ass, to be honest.
You have to?
Yeah, I mean, that's just the way everything is done. And
How so?
well, hey, you want to come and look at a horse? Great. Well, let's first drink some vodka, and we'll pour a little offering to the gods, and we'll flick a little bit into the sky as an offering to the sky god. It'd be rude to refuse because it's an offering.
Right.
And then, I mean, to be fair, I was in my mid-20s, so I was quite happy just to drink the stuff. But this kind of quite unpleasant pinch drinking vodka and just bottles. So I spent this long day going from person to person to person out in the sticks, driving across grassland off-road. And finally, we met these people who this guy had a horse to sell. And he said, yeah, here's the horse, do you want to check it out? And I was like, all right, I had never ridden a horse before, I didn't know what I was looking for. But I thought, I'll check out the hooves. I was about to try and check the back hooves, and they're like, no, don't do that, you'll get your face kicked off. But I checked the front hooves, I checked its teeth, it was a female horse, didn't look too old. Decent, strong, coat was in good condition. I thought, yeah, this is fine. And we agreed a price, and about 2 days later, I had to go back to the capital to get my stuff, buy a saddle. About 2 days later, I came back, met the guy, and he presented me with this horse. I was like, well, that's a different colour, and it's got testicles. So that's a different horse altogether, but it wasn't really much I could do about it. So this horse didn't really take to being ridden. I don't think it was too small. I don't think he could really cope with me and my not very heavy bags.
So you just use it sort of as a pack horse?
Yeah. So we walked, and at night I would make a fire. You'd hear wolves howling often. I'd make a fire and sort of tether the horse 10 yards away, and that's kind of the first line of defence. And one morning the horse had been, the tether had been cut and something in the night. But I'd pretty much got to where I was going. Oh, before I forget, this is a Mongolian wolf tooth for you, which an old hunter gave me. He claimed that he shot the wolf, but I was not 100% sure about that. Well, there's a kind of a, braggadocio element to it. It's kind of a macho thing to have shot wolves, and I met a lot of people who said, yeah, I've killed many wolves. But back in Soviet times, there were, Mongolia was kind of a satellite. It wasn't technically there used to be a quota every Mongolian man to kill 2 wolves each year to keep their numbers down, otherwise they would decimate the livestock. Anyway, that's from a wolf that he got hold of somehow.
You're skeptical, though.
Well, I'm a skeptic, generally, I think. And the way he told me, it didn't give me necessarily the impression that
Do you know the story about the World War I Russian-German standoff with wolves?
They took like a 2-day truce.
Yeah. They took a truce. They stopped fighting to kill the wolves because there were so many soldiers were getting killed by wolves.
Isn't that one of the stories?
It was something insane. They had the problem was they were fighting trench warfare, right? And so they would get shot and they would be crying and screaming out in these trenches, and then you would hear when people would be eaten alive by wolves.
Yeah.
the wolves would find these wounded soldiers and tear them apart, and then people would go out on scouting missions and they wouldn't find anything but boots and and pieces of their clothes covered in blood, and then they realized, like, Jesus Christ, we're losing more people to wolves than we are to the Germans or the Russians.
Actually, just earlier this year, I came across a memorial to Finnish POWs who had been sent up to this distant part of Siberia from that war, people who had been captured. It was crazy to think they'd been captured like way out there and sort of, in Europe, and they've been sent to this desolate spot at the end of the continent and just told to fish to sort of supply the Russian Navy, I think it was. But there are all these, like, on the cliffs at the north of Asia, like facing out. I mean, you can't imagine a more like barren, isolated, brutal spot. And there was just I saw one. I was told there was another somewhere nearby that I didn't spot. Just a crucifix set up for the dead Finns. I don't know how many were sent out there. I haven't looked it up yet. But yeah, so if the wolves don't get you and the Russians do, then the cold will get you eventually.
What was what's the terrain like in Mongolia when you're making your way through this?
Mostly steppe grassland, but I went through some sort of low mountains. It's an incredible country, Mongolia. Like it's just so ripe for adventure. It's about the same size as Spain, France, and Germany put together. But the population's just over 3 million. And
oh wow!
It's the most sparsely populated country on Earth.
Really?
There's kind of a person per square kilometre. But more than half the population live in the capital, and there are a handful of other not big but towns. And so the countryside's just open. And
what is the capital like?
It's changed a lot since I first went. It was all just kind of grim Soviet apartment blocks, and it's set in this kind of valley. In winter, I've not been there in winter, but in winter it's the most polluted city on Earth, because everyone there's kind of increasingly people are being drawn into the capital from outside, and they come in and set up their yurts, or gurs as they call them, these kind of circular felt tents which you can survive the harshest conditions in. But to heat them, they're just using coal or yak shit or horse shit or cow shit. And so just all of the particulate matter. So it's the most polluted by a particular count on the PM10, I think, is the size of the particle, which I think if you breathe in, they can get quite deep into your lungs, but not all the way to the tips, like that tiny ones in Beijing, for instance. There's just this kind of pall of pollution that hangs over this narrow, long valley that the capital's stretched along. But recently, they've got, I think there's like a Shangri-La there now and some high glass buildings, and it's changing quite a lot. They had in about 2012, they opened a huge mine that, I think Toktogoi, I think the name, I forget. But in 2012, The Economist magazine found Mongolia to have the world's fastest growing economy, because they opened this one mine and overnight the economy grew by 40%, like that month.
It's all relative, right?
Yeah, and exactly, yeah. It was a very, very low base start line. But yeah, I think that's largely gold and copper. And since then, there's been a lot of wrangling over how much, what percentage of the profits is kept channeled into Mongolia and what percentage goes outside. But I think that's turned the country around quite a lot. But there's no fences. The whole countryside's just, there's the Gobi Desert, there's sort of taiga, like Siberian forest across the north. There are the Altai Mountains in the west. The rest is grasslands, and there's lakes and rivers everywhere. And there's just no fences. It's all common land, and you can just head wherever you want. It's awesome. It's really great.
It's wild that they still use those felt tents, because that was literally what Genghis Khan.
Yeah, exactly the same. And nowadays they'll have maybe a car battery to run. They'll have a satellite dish and a TV, and it's changing quite a lot. There's only one or two homes I visited that still looked really quite similar to internally how they would have 800 years ago when Genghis Khan was charging across the continent.
Wow. And so this trek through Mongolia took you how long?
I was there for 3 months in total. So I did 2 months on the horse, and then once the horse was pinched, I got to more or less where I wanted to go, and so then I got the bike back and carried on cycling sort of through to Central Asia.
And then once you get to Central Asia, then how long before you get back to where you wanted to go?
Well, this was all part of that same long bike ride. So, there was probably still 2 years to go to get down through.
Sorry, that's so crazy.
2.5 perhaps.
That is so
crazy. Through like Central Asia, the Middle East, and down the whole east side of Africa.
Now, are you corresponding with anyone back home while this is happening? Do people know you're safe? Like, how are you?
I emailed sort of as and when I could. When I took the ferry from Britain to France at the beginning of the trip, I had phones were different back then. I had a really old, it wasn't a Nokia 3310, but it was something along those lines. This is 2010. I think the first iPhone might have just come out, but it's a long time ago.
I think that was 2007, if I remember correctly.
Oh right, okay.
Was it? Something like that. I think the first iPhone somewhere around then, because there's. Yeah, I think somewhere around then.
But I didn't want a phone, I wanted sort of freedom from all that. And my plan had been, I arranged my phone contract or company that the contract would run out around about that time. And I'd planned when crossing the channel to go up to the top of the ferry and just hurl it into the sea. The ferry company kindly gave me like a free crossing in their sort of club class, and the bar was quite open. So I didn't get around to that. And a few weeks later, I just sort of tossed it in a lake in Sweden, which with hindsight I don't feel good about. That's plastic.
Right.
I shouldn't have done that, but it was.
But it's symbolic.
Time. Yeah. So I didn't. I kept in touch with family through email as often as I could.
Just use like internet cafes.
Exactly. Yeah. Or if if I couldn't find that, I got quite good at just like going into some random office and saying, hey, can I use your computer?
Really?
People were surprisingly receptive. You're in the middle of Iraqi Kurdistan. Can I use your computer? Yeah, sure. Just turn it off when you're done. Oh, thanks.
Wow.
People are very friendly wherever you go, broadly speaking.
That's really fascinating because you probably have a different perspective of just running into strangers in other countries than most people do. Most people would think that people would be very hesitant. Some weird Englishman shows up and wants to use your computer.
Well, I think wherever I go, I tend to sort of be a bit of a novelty, so people are interested initially.
Did you anticipate that though? Like, what did you think you were going to be able to do, or did you just figure it out along the way?
Yeah, I just figured it out as I went.
So you didn't have any plan, like this is how I'll make sure that everyone knows I'm okay?
No. Back then I probably wasn't great at sort of keeping my parents in the loop exactly as to where I was. And when I went to Afghanistan, I didn't tell them about it. I told one friend, I said, if you don't hear from me in 6 weeks, then let's call the government. And so I tried to keep them sort of as unworried as possible. Which, I've got 3 siblings, so there's spares. It's all right.
Spares. So when you get done with this trip, this is a 4-year trip. What do you do? Do you have a home at this point in time, or did you not have an apartment anymore?
No, I hadn't. I had nowhere to. I went back to my parents' place for 3 weeks. And I had £30 to my name when I came back.
What is the first day back like? Like when you show up at your parents' house, what is that like?
Weird. About 2 months before I finished, I think I was still somewhere in southern Morocco or Mauritania. My dad said via email, let's have a party when you get back. Let's have a sort of a homecoming. And so we picked a time and a date and arranged a place in London, a street where friends of mine could come and gather, and we had a little sort of welcome home party. So I was told, at the stroke of 7 o'clock, you've got to be here on the street. And I turned up, and there were 120, 150 people, some whom I hadn't seen for years and years and years. It was totally surreal.
Wow.
I was still quite, the 6 months following, this was about 6 months on from when I was ill in Congo. My health hadn't been good throughout that, so I'd been on my ride up through France, for instance. Winter was coming, and I was getting these incredible stomach cramps every now and then. I remember one particular day when I basically just kind of veered off the road in a village and fell into someone's woodshed. And then about 10 minutes later, I kind of came round, and there was just this elderly French couple standing over me, not wondering what to do with me. So I wasn't particularly well. But I turned up at this homecoming party, with a beard down to my tits and hair down to my shoulders. I looked like a right state, to be honest. And it was strange how quickly I felt kind of normal back among people again, initially at least. It was over the coming days that the kind of a weird itch of wanting to move came back. And
so you got wanderlust almost immediately afterwards?
In the I guess a couple of weeks on, the novelty of having a comfy bed each night wore off pretty quick, and I needed to find a job to earn some money. So I picked up the first job I could find, and it's not the sort of job that I think I was going to do long term, but it was just enough to get me back on my feet.
What did you do?
I sold luxury tours to China for a travel company. And so I talked to clients saying, well, exactly. I talked to clients saying, you've got to go to this place, it's great. And they say, what was your experience like there? I said, well, the ground's good and firm, you can put a tent wherever you want, but the high end will probably be comfortable, you'll be fine. That was not necessarily the best fit for me as a job. But soon after that, I started planning the next trip and started writing these books. And so since then, I've kind of turned that into a career.
So immediately you sort of understood when you returned that this is not a one-off, this is something you're just going to continue to do.
Yeah. Well, people started asking me to give presentations about the trip I've been on, photo slideshows we had. And I started doing more and more of those to village halls and clubs and festivals and schools and businesses, and that slowly became about half of my living. And I realised I could do this for a job. This could be a living, and enable me to carry on taking on challenges. So since then, there's always something in the pipeline. Do some sort of journey, come back, relate the story, write about it, repeat.
Now, when you start up again, is there any hesitation about the length of the trip, that 4-year thing? Even though I'm sure it must have been a fascinating and wonderful experience, there had to be a little bit of a hesitation of committing to that much of your life again.
The longest I've done since then is 8 months. So it's a lot different. And the last couple have been 2 or 3 months.
But was it because of that 4-year one where you're like, that's a little much?
Well, you get a bit more settled. Or also now I've started to kind of build a career. You don't want to totally put everything on pause for a huge amount of time again.
You mean by build a career, the writing?
Yeah, the
books?
writing and the speaking, and
Yeah.
you know, it's not like I have, you know, a monthly paycheck or a, you know, a salary, a pension, anything like that. So you kind of got to keep feeding the beast.
And so for the speeches, like, what are you doing? Are you like posting up at a theater and people come to see you talk?
I do some at theatres, a lot at schools. Ones for businesses will be at conferences, or they just want someone to come in for the afternoon to kind of, you know, spark up their team, or you know, a real variety, all sorts of different events.
You would be the last person I would want to have come to talk. Because I was like, these people are going to quit and they're going to go wander the world. And I'm going to have no workforce.
I've spoken to a handful of CEOs about that, and one, maybe charitably, but I think he was right. He said, you know, I kind of said what you said as a joke. And he said, well, you know what, if I've got a member of staff, if I've got an employee who wants to go away for that huge amount of time, then they probably shouldn't be working for me. You know, it's like, you know, that's not going to be the most motivated person. But I'm not there to, you know, say, hey, you know, quit your job and fuck off for years on a bicycle. I'm there to try and, I mean, with businesses, it's different talks, different events, it's all different. But with businesses, I'm there to kind of take some of the lessons about resilience, you know, ambition, etc., from what I've been doing, and try and apply that to their lives and to their stuff.
But aren't those lessons only learned through the experiences? I mean, I would imagine
They're definitely best learned through experiences.
Yeah.
But I think you can, in the same way that, I mean, one of the biggest genres of literature is self-help, right? Mm-hmm. And that's just reading about it.
I think most of that is nonsense, though. I think, like, literally, when I look at, like, self-help books and self-help people and mentors and stuff, there's a large percentage, more than half, that's nonsense.
At the risk of insulting a few people I know, I totally agree with you.
Yeah.
But then again, I haven't read those books, and also
I haven't read all of them, clearly, but I've read enough bullshit where I'm like, God.
Yeah, well, there's a huge tendency out there for people to kind of take on the persona of a guru, essentially.
Yes.
You know, and there's so many charlatans out there. There are so many, you know, it's like with a lot of esoteric pursuits and alternative things. You know, there's things that are rooted in fact, or that are kind of, you know, veering that way, and there are things that are, I mean, like mediums, for instance.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't mind saying it, I don't care who people listening, I've got no time for that, because as far as I'm concerned, they're either, I think the two ways they describe it are, they're either open eye, which means they know they're conning everyone, or they're shut eye, which means that they, you know, they genuinely believe what they're doing, and you know, that's a different thing. I'm kind of fine with that. It's just I don't think they're right.
Yeah, I have a friend who went to a medium, and it's kind of a hilarious story, because he goes, he knew everything about my grandmother, knew everything about this. I go, don't you know everything about your grandmother? What the fuck is the point of someone telling you some things you already know?
Yeah, that are on your Facebook page.
Do you think that it's possible that these were leading questions, and that through these leading questions, they sort of talked you into giving them the answers? And you can see the look on his face when he was kind of resisting, but realizing that I might be right, but didn't want to admit that he got hosed.
I think there's a lot of people just want to believe it.
Yeah.
And that's also totally understandable. You know, it's the same, like, from my perspective
Yeah.
with, you know, belief in afterlife. People want to
Right.
believe that because it's comforting. It totally makes sense to want to believe it. I personally don't. But
You don't believe in any sort of afterlife?
I don't, no.
But do you disbelieve?
Meaning?
I don't believe in it either, but I don't disbelieve in
Well,
it.
I can never know that it's not.
Right.
But I guess the burden of proof is on people who have come up with this idea, because there's nothing to substantiate it.
But there's a long history of human understanding that there's something else besides what we experience in this realm. And I think a lot of it has to do, most likely, through either the consumption of psychedelic compounds or through ritual practices like holotropic breathing or something, where it gives in the sense that maybe what you see is only part of the picture. And then there's this feeling when someone dies, like they're not there anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Like, have you've ever been around a dead body?
I have, yeah.
It's a weird feeling, right? It's like, it's not just that they're dead. It's not just they're not breathing anymore. They're not there. Yeah, it's hard to explain. But the first time I ever saw a dead body was my grandfather. It was an open casket, and I remember immediately thinking, like, oh,
That's not him.
He's not there.
Yeah.
Like, he's not there. It's not as simple as, well, it's also weird because they had him made up and shit. You know, they put makeup on you, which is very odd.
Yeah.
But it's this very clear feeling that he's gone. And so there's this thought, well, where did he go? Did he go somewhere else? Is there a place where you go?
Mm-hmm.
You know,
And that's a totally
Yeah.
understandable thing to think, and to, you know, to kind of experiment with the idea of. But
Right.
I suppose it can never be
Proven.
So it's kind of a moot point anyway, I guess.
I mean, it's interesting. It's interesting to discuss. I don't disbelieve, but I don't believe.
But I also think that's a slightly different thing about mediums.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm a huge fan of the amazing Randy.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, James Randi.
Darren Brown, various people who
Yes.
who sort of, you know, unlock or rather give away some of the secrets of cold reading and show you just how easy it is to manipulate people's beliefs.
Yes. Yeah, Darren is very open about that. And there's a guy named Banachek who I've had on the podcast before as well as Darren. And Banachek is the first guy that I ever met that openly talked about the techniques that he used. He's like, I'm not going to tell you the techniques, but I'm going to tell you this is bullshit.
Yeah.
I am tricking these people into thinking that I can read into them and find out about their past and find out about their life. It's just bullshit.
Well, Randy went to, the sort of big evangelical churches where they have faith healers and people contacting the other side. And he went there, and I think I'm remembering this right. Either his one of his accomplices essentially just went there with a little shortwave radio and just scanned through the settings until he found the feed to the sort of pastor's ear, feeding the information that someone else was researching online for these sort of unwitting audience members, which is it's hilarious, and it's also deeply disturbing because
it's deeply
people
disturbing.
get taken for thousands. They can. It's just taking advantage of the most vulnerable people.
Yeah.
No time for that.
And there's only one step removed from that to a lot of these motivational people. Because my feeling on these motivational people is that a lot of them are taking advantage of the fact that some people have this longing for discipline and structure and some sort, like they've experienced moments in their life where things are going well and then things fall apart, or they self-sabotage, or they start drinking or gambling or whatever their problem is. But these people that are motivating these people that they're charging exorbitant amounts of money for some structure that they put together, they want these folks to follow. But then when you look into their lives, the people that are the motivational people, most of them haven't done shit. Like, all they're doing is motivating people, which doesn't, like, if you want to have a conversation about how to invest with Warren Buffett, well, that makes sense to me. Like, here's a man who's spent his life investing successfully in businesses. He's very well versed in that. He can give you some understanding of the practices that he uses. But if you're going to talk to someone who's trying to motivate you for success, and his only success is to tricking people into coming to see him motivate people for success and charging them exorbitant amounts of money for it, well, then I don't like that.
Well, it's the same as the irony of Trump having written The Art of the Deal, or rather having had someone ghostwrite it for him. Trump, who was just born into a huge amount of money and by all accounts just slowly lost it over years and years and years.
Yeah.
I think it's far too easy for people to abuse other people's sort of good faith. We're generally credulous creatures. We want to believe stuff. We want things to believe in.
Well, we also don't, there's so much uncertainty about the future. And so there's this longing for someone to hold our hand. Someone please show me. Someone please give me a guide. Someone please tell me the steps to follow.
Yeah.
And when people see that people have this longing, they take advantage of it, and they try to get these people to pay money for these secrets. If you sign up now, I will give you the secrets of how you can become successful. And you're sitting there in your shitty apartment, you're like, fuck, I want to be successful.
It's Scientology, isn't it? It's
similar.
Same thing.
Well, I think that's more like how to organize your life. But it's similar.
It's
similar. I mean,
secrets that you unlock to success.
I mean, written by one of the worst science fiction writers ever. You ever read some of his stuff?
I don't plan to.
Oh, my God. Well, I've had the guy who's the head guy of Scientology. What the fuck's his name again? Yeah, I had his dad, Ron Miscavige, on. He explained to me how he got his son into it and the whole deal behind it. It's just fucking fascinating because it deals with those very questions. Like, it deals with psychology. It deals with, like, the longing for answers in this purely uncertain, open-ended life that we exist in. And so many people have that desire for structure and for someone to come along and tell them that everything is going to be okay if you follow these rules, which is obviously not true.
Yeah, I mean, I don't... when I'm billed as a quote-unquote motivational speaker, I actually don't like that phrasing. I would prefer, inspirational. I tend to, it's almost an entertaining storytelling exercise, but with, certain themes that people can, take away if they want to. But I've never liked the idea of ramming down people's throats a bullet-pointed step-by-step of better, more proactive, more motivated, or anything like that. Because I think, as you're saying, it's quite often.
Most of the time. I know a guy who does it who used to be a terrible comedian, and then he became a motivational guy, and now he's much more successful at that. But it's just so strange and sad to watch these people buy into his nonsense. Like, he's not successful, like, except at taking people and getting them to pay a lot of money to teach them how to be successful.
Yeah, it's like a shitty pyramid scheme.
It is in a way, but it's a confidence game. You're you're playing upon people's desire for answers that don't exist. I mean, you can motivate people. Like, there's a lot of people, don't get me wrong, there's a lot of people out there that are super successful that can tell you how they did it. And there's a lot of benefit in that. There's great benefit in that. But most of those people are not charging you for that. I mean, they might write a book about it, or they, maybe they do a podcast on, how to succeed at business or something like that. But they're good at it. They actually have experience. But there's a fucking whole industry. And online, because of social media, the barrier for entry is so small that you see so many people with these. Everything is motivational. All their posts are motivational. Like, surely you have to have some other shit to say other than motivating people. It's weird.
Yeah, I mean, I try to focus on telling stories. Like if you've read those, for instance, you might find some inspiration, and hopefully it's just going to be interesting.
Well, what you're doing is, I mean, obviously you have these super unusual life experiences that you can relay. And that's my thing about it is, like, God, if I heard those, I would be very tempted to go and want some of those experiences for myself.
Well, a lot of my experiences have been sort of how not to.
Right. Well, that's how you learn, right?
Yeah, exactly. Learn from my mistakes. Actually, I think that's always valid as well. It's a lot easier, I think, to take something on board from someone who says, this is what I did and it went horribly wrong, and this is why I wouldn't do it again like that, than to say, I did this and I'm fantastic and it went really well and you're a different person. It might be the same for you.
Well, speaking of horribly wrong, let's talk about your most recent one, because this is what led you here, and this is a wild experience that you just returned from, and tell people what you've done.
Sure. So I've been planning for almost a year to go to a region of Siberia called Yakutia, which is, it's the largest administrative area in the world. So it's one region of Russia. It's almost the same size as India. I think it's about 96% the size of India. But only 1 million people, so it's massive and empty, and it's far north. About half of it is north of the Arctic Circle, and there's one large city, but outside that there are scattered some remote and very remote communities, and they're, for the most part, there are plenty of sort of crumbling, near abandoned industrial towns from the Soviet era as well. But there are lots of scattered small villages of indigenous Siberian peoples, particularly the Sakha, who are the largest ethnicity in the region. And then there are smaller peoples like the Yeveni, the Evenki, who traditionally herded reindeer. There's all sorts of people scattered across this massive area. And I wanted to head out there. It's also the coldest inhabited place on Earth. So the recorded low, and Jamie might be able to confirm this, but a place called Verkhoyansk. I can't remember the exact temperature, and it's in Celsius anyway, but about minus 67.3, something like that. And that's inhabited. People live there. And so every winter it's super cold, and people survive in that. And they used to survive, many of them in a sort of nomadic sense, living in sort of skin tents. Reindeer hide teepees, essentially. So I wanted to get out there, experience some element, not in the total depths of winter, but in sort of February, March, April, of that extreme cold.
Isn't February the cold depths of winter?
January's their coldest.
What is February?
Well, I mean, I was prepared for minus 50 Celsius, which is sort of about minus 60 Fahrenheit.
They hit the same at minus 40.
Yeah, but
Yeah,
because
and then it
each degree is
branches
different, it
off.
gets confusing straight away. So I wanted to get out there, experience this cold, and just meet some of these people scattered around, and kind of see what their lives are like, and also see if they're changing with if their lives, their sort of traditional ways of life are being threatened by the climate changing. In last summer, when you might remember, it was all over the news for a while, perhaps less so in America because you guys got your own wildfires here, but an island in Greece, Evia, was on fire. But at the same time, an area the size of Belgium in Yakutia, all collectively, all the different wildfires at the same time. So they have crazy bad wildfires out there. Also, just close to Verkhoyansk, that town with the record cold, they had a record Arctic high of 39 point something degrees Celsius. Again, about 100.
Yeah, that's high.
It's about the same as here today, I think.
Yeah.
And
all the way up there.
Yeah, in the Arctic Circle.
That's
so
insane.
Yeah, I just wanted to go and check it out, see what it was like. So I planned to hike a few hundred miles along frozen rivers, which in winter for about 3 months get sort of ploughed and turned into ice roads. Zimnik or Zimniki, as they call them there. A bit like a sort of ice road truck is, I guess. I don't know. But as you're on the river, the river's frozen perhaps 2 meters thick, and towards the top on the frozen sea ice. And to hike up to this town called Tixi up on the north coast. It's a port town. But I flew in on the 21st of February. And the world changed a lot in the sort of 3 or 4 days after that. The day after I arrived, Russian forces marched across the border where they'd been massing, up to, I think, about 140,000 troops by the time I flew out. And when I flew out, with hindsight, it all seems kind of stupid to have gone, maybe foolhardy. But at the time, basically the entire world, except for presumably Putin, the US intelligence and UK intelligence, which both seem to think something's going to happen. But all the world's media, all commentators, all pundits were saying this is just a bluff. This is just Putin trying to, scare NATO into concessions, to get more promises that NATO won't spread it, that Ukraine won't join NATO, whatever else. But they marched across the border, and 2 days later they formal invasion. They launched their full-scale nationwide invasion, marched into Kiev, bombed everything. And I was so far away from all this. Batagai, the small town where I started hiking up in the Arctic. That is geographically the same distance from Vancouver as it is from Kiev. It was just really, really far away. Closer to the North Pole. I was east of Pyongyang. I was on the same time zone as Central Australia. Just really, really far away. And I kind of thought about it, and I thought, well, I'm here, and it's going to be interesting. I'm possibly one of, if not the last tourists in Russia, certainly out in the east. And I've got this almost unique but accidental opportunity to see this country and the lives of normal people, ordinary citizens, as what seems to be a horrific, potentially the brink of World War III starts to unfold. And so I thought, right, well, I'm going to carry on with this trek, but I'll just try and keep across, information. But as soon as I got to Batagai, it's a short flight from the capital of the region up to Batagai on an old Antonov twin prop plane. And from there onwards, I couldn't get any phone signal. Basically, the only real information I could get was local state media. I passed a village perhaps once a week, and you turn on the most insane thing was turning on you'll be aware of this, I'm sure. But you turn on the local news out there, and they're talking about Ukraine on their news segments, and every second or third sentence will have the word fascism or Nazism, and they were slowly just drip feeding is the wrong word. They were just gushing this false information out into their public space, and loads of people believed everything they heard, totally believed everything. I remember while I was still in the capital, just the day after I arrived, the troops had gone into the Donbass, this disputed territory in the east that they're sort of annexing. And that evening, I was in some guy's sort of cabin just outside town. We met and went for drinks with some other people, and he said, "Hey, let's go back to us for some drinks." And this guy, I'll call him Anatol. I don't want to say his name, but he started dicing up some horse ribs to cook us some sort of pepperoni and everything. And he asked me what I thought about Ukraine. This is really early days, and I said, "Well, I had to be careful with what I was saying. I don't know that much about it, but it seems like this is going to get really serious. And I'm also aware that when I turn on my phone and look at the news apps, the information I get from the BBC or the Guardian or whatever else is totally different from what I see here." Of course, I knew all this, but I was sort of couching it in terms that gave him the chance to. I didn't want to preach.
Yeah.
And he said, "Yeah, well, it's great because Vladimir Putin is making Russia great again. And this is Russian land, and it belongs to Russia, and those Ukrainians are all Nazis anyway. And we're going to they're performing genocide on Russian peoples." And the thing I found craziest about all this, not just the fact that he was so precisely parroting Putin's propaganda, which I had assumed beforehand people would be taking with a pinch of salt, but the fact that this guy was Sakha. He's not a Slav. He's not a white Russian. This guy is from a people who about 400 years ago were brutally, aggressively colonized by a sort of militaristic, expansionist, czarist Russia, who spread into the area and just took over. And I just thought somehow, with hindsight naively, that these people that were from a ethnically different background, heritage, might not be quite so sold on the cause of Russian nationalism, which is essentially what Putin used to sell the invasion in the first place. But no, he was totally sold on it. And then just as the following kind of weeks unfolded, as I started hiking, the war ramped up, I only got little snippets of information. It was very hard to know what was actually going on. I just met more and more people with, to be frank, a complete gamut of opinions. I met lots of people who, like him, were just bullish and quite, hawkish. Yeah, we'll take back Ukraine. It belongs to Russia. They're all fascists. And then I met people who quietly, I'm not going to say any names, but people who, like, one-on-one would quietly confide, I'm not quite sure about this. I don't quite believe everything I'm being told. Or even some people who said, I'm ashamed to be Russian. I'm embarrassed about this. I don't feel like I'm part of this country now. But
what was your feeling going through? So you're going through this trip. You have no idea that this is going to happen. It starts happening while you're there, and then you find yourself accidentally involved in the sense that you're a foreign observer trapped in this land where all this crazy shit is going down. Are you thinking you have to get out of there? Are you thinking you are a part of this now? You're going to document what you're seeing, and this will add to whatever you're writing in the future?
A bit of both, really. It occurred to me a bunch of times: should I be leaving? Should I be getting out of here? Just days after the invasion, flights Russian flights to Europe were all, the airlines were sanctioned. They couldn't fly into European airports. So my flight, hadn't yet been formally cancelled, but it wasn't going to happen. I knew that much. So getting out was already going to be complicated. But I didn't feel personally threatened, and perhaps I should have. I suppose I felt like I'm essentially a neutral observer, but of course I wasn't, because I'm British, and Britain very quickly took a stance along with the EU and America, pro-Ukraine stance. And it's great, here wandering around Austin, you see Ukrainian flags everywhere. And after finally getting home, I went to little villages in the countryside, and the church had a Ukrainian flag hoisted on top of the flag. The West, for want of a better term, really took up the cause of Ukraine very, very quickly. And I suppose that made me not a neutral observer, but a representative of the opposition, if not the enemy. But I've been in trouble with the authorities in Russia before, on previous occasions. I've been through the Russian court system a couple of times.
How so?
In 2017, I was skiing through the Ural Mountains, which is they kind of divide European Russia from Siberia, and came into a town for a resupply after a couple of months out in the mountains, and the police arrested me and my friend, and so we were on business visas, because the longest tourist visa you could get back then was only 30 days. We needed 3 months plus. So we got business visas, and they said you're committing tourism while travelling on a business visa. So we were taken to court for committing tourism, for sort of abusing the.
Could you explain
grounds.
that is your business?
Yeah. I mean,
did that work?
They didn't go for it, but I mean the fine was £20 or something.
Well, you have books, though. I would imagine.
Well, I didn't yet have.
Okay.
But I mean, I had a website. But then, later we got a border infraction. We were kayaking down a river on the border of Russia and Kazakhstan. It turns out where the river is, the border is not allowed to be. And then months later in Georgia, we were up in the mountains of Georgia, and I mean, it's dumb really. We used Google Maps to tell us how to get to this town, Gori, which incidentally is where Stalin was born. And Google Maps said, yep, you come down out of this valley, out of the mountains into this valley, go up river, there's a river through the valley, go up river for about a mile, cross the bridge, and then carry on the road, and you'll be there this evening. Great, easy. We went down, and then at the bridge there were Georgian soldiers, police I think, and they said, no, it's closed. And they wouldn't explain why. And I had some Russian by this point, so I could have understood if they explained, but they didn't. They just said, no, it's closed, just go away. And so I kind of put it into Google again, and it said, yeah, it's going to be like a day and a half. It's like a longer way around. And we were sort of after it, keen for a rest. And I thought, well, the river doesn't look that deep. So we went, a few hundred meters downstream and just pushed our bikes across. It was like ankle deep. Got to the other side, scrambled up a bank, got on the road, started cycling, and thought, yeah, finally we've got one over on the authorities. It's always been a bit of a headache. And about 30 seconds later, a military jeep sped up behind us and sort of pulled over in front of us. And the soldier climbed out. And the first thing I noticed is he had the Russian tricolor of the flag on his arm. I thought, well, that's strange, because the border is about 50 miles north of here. And he said, what are you doing here? And I said, what are you doing here? Which isn't the right thing to say when a Russian soldier arrests you. He said, Здесь Южная Ossetia. This is South Ossetia, which is that there was a short 5-day war in 2008, and Russia just sort of invaded and annexed part of Georgia. And it turned out the river was the border, and we had unwittingly just crossed into it. So we got... it's part of Russia essentially, but it's set up like the Donbass is already being, as a kind of a little puppet state. And when they were interrogating us under the frowning portrait of Putin, they were saying, why did you do this? It's a border. Why have you violated our sovereign territory? And I said, it was just the maps on our phone. And the guy who said, Google Maps, right? And I said, yeah. And he goes, it's an American company. Yeah. I said, well, America doesn't recognise South Ossetia. So Google Maps just told me to go through this disputed territory.
Jesus, Google.
Later I looked at it, and there's a tiny little dotted line, but the route, it just looks over there. I said, who does recognise it? And he said, well, the South Ossetians do, and Russia does. Sure, it's given. And I said, anyone else? And he said, yeah, Venezuela and Nicaragua. and he said, also, have you heard of Nauru? It's a tiny little Pacific island nation of about 10,000 people. They're the only people back then. Anyway, so I was familiar with Russian. I know that being arrested in Russia for some minor sort of administrative infraction isn't necessarily a huge deal. Both those times I've given a small fine and sent on my way. But this time, this winter, after about 3 weeks of hiking, I arrived at this town. It was the only town.
Can I stop you?
Yeah.
So did they let you go?
In South Ossetia.
Yeah. Once they pulled you over, how do you get out of it?
We were in a cell for a night, and then in court, where the judge said, "Is there anything you want to say?" I said, well, I'm really hungry. They haven't been fed up. And the judge started screaming at the police, said, get them some food straight away. So, it was all friendly and fine. They then, at sunset, marched us through all this kind of, razor wire and concrete defences and unexploded ordnance signs and handed us over to the Georgian authorities.
Do you have to explain what you're doing?
The Georgians were across it because it'd been put out on the FSB sort of communication, so they knew that the two tourists had got in trouble. And sure enough, on the other side of the border, there were people from the British Embassy, Georgian police, the tourism industry, the Ministry of the Interior. So we had this long debrief.
But you're not supposed to be there, right? You're not so.
Well, we crossed the border, not knowing it was a border, so it was totally innocent. But we crossed the border illegally because it is a border.
How would you be able to cross it legally?
Well, only from Russia.
Only from Russia.
Yeah.
So that area where you crossed it's just illegal to cross in that area.
Yeah.
So did you explain what you do and
how
did they respond to that?
I explained. I think they very quickly understood that we weren't spies. This is 5 years ago.
Right.
They very quickly understood that we weren't spies. It wasn't obviously quite such a time of heightened tension stuff now.
Right. But now, when you got in trouble with the Russian authorities, it was a much more serious issue.
Yeah. Well, this time I didn't, and I stand by this. I didn't do anything wrong, but they were seemed quite quickly looking for a way to get me. So it was known where I was at all times. Although there was only one settlement every week, this river, the road was in it on the river I was hiking along, saw perhaps 15 trucks a day hauling coal from a port at the river mouth, hundreds of kilometres away, all the way down to Batagai, the town where I started hiking to fuel the region with power. And so people were clearly, as I found out later, reporting to the authorities where I was at any given time. The two villages I passed through before reaching the first town, it was quickly sort of by the village elders, I think, sort of, because there's no presence of authorities in these villages. They're tiny, 300-400 people. It was passed on where I was. So when I approached Ust-Kuiga, this town, which used to have 5,000 or 6,000 residents, now there's like 500 or 600. So basically, there's not many people just living scattered among the ruins. On the north side of the town, there's a cement factory that was built and completed just before the Soviet Union fell apart. So it never produced a single sack of cement because there was no longer any reason to live in this like desolate, sort of throwaway town in the middle of nowhere. The Soviets were really keen to kind of evenly populate this huge expanse of land that they owned. So they built sort of industrial settlements all over the place. Anyway, as I approached Ust-Kuiga, a police jeep was waiting for me a few miles outside town. And they said, get into the jeep for a chat. I said, that's fine. And actually that morning had been my coldest, minus 48, 49 degrees Celsius that morning, which I think is about 55 Fahrenheit. And so my feet were still numb, and I was only too happy to get in the car and have a chat with them in the walk. And they asked me all these questions for about an hour. What are you doing here? So this was in my very pigeon Russian presence. What are you doing here? Why are you visiting? And I just said, I'm here. I'm interested in the culture, the traditions, the backgrounds, the winter, the wildlife. I'm a tourist. And they made me sign a document promising to obey the rules of the country while I was in it, which fair enough. But then they drove off. Well, they took selfies with me and then drove off. And then I continued into the town. And
they
the
took
next
selfies?
Day, oh, everyone takes selfies in Russia.
Really?
Yeah. In fact, they even refer to any picture with a person in it as a selfie. It doesn't need to be taken by oneself. That's an English word that's just bled through into Russian for a picture.
Interesting.
And again, selfies, I found out later that people were taking selfies with me, truckers along the way, and then these were popping up on various kind of Instagram accounts in the area that lots of people followed. People were totally aware of where I was and what I was doing. And again, I had nothing to hide. But in Ust-Kuiga, they came and found me. They came and knocked on the door in the place that I was staying. I was there for 3 nights. And they said, come to the police station for registration. That's fine. Again, no problem. And in the police station, slowly it became clear that they were giving me a fine. And when I asked, what's the fine for? And I wasn't initially concerned. What's the fine for? And they said, you're conducting journalism while travelling on a tourist visa. You can now get, briefly could, I guess you can't now, get a 90-day tourist visa to Russia as of recently. So this time I was on the correct visa, a tourist visa. But they said, you're conducting journalism. And I said, I'm not. And they said, no, you're a journalist. We've seen on your website you've written for the BBC, which is true, but travel pieces. You've written for these newspapers, again, travel articles based on essentially tourism. And they said, well, that's journalism here. And we also hear you've been talking to people. And I said, well, yeah, that's not illegal. And you've been taking photographs, again, no problem. But they then suddenly claimed that I'd been asking provocative questions about the, as they call it, a special operation. Because the war, within Russia, the war is not a war. It's illegal to call it a war. It's a special operation. It's part of this kind of strange, nothing is true.
So are people reporting you along the way? I mean, did you ascertain how this got to these soldiers?
Well, they knew I was, the route I was following was, along this river, over some hills to another river, and then up to this town on the coast. And so there was no secret that I was going to come through Oostquigge. And they knew what day it was going to be because someone had probably reported seeing my tent, 20 miles down the road the previous night where I camped. And it became quite clear that they had... So we spoke for a while, and eventually when they started making these accusations, I said, look, right, I don't really understand exactly what you're saying. I need you to find a translator. And so they found some guy who spoke a bit of English, and he translated as best he could. And they basically come up with, they sort of fabricated witnesses who said, yeah, he was asking about the war in Ukraine. He called it a war. He was trying to sort of provoke, difficult conversations. And it really wasn't the case. And frankly, wherever I went, almost one of the first questions people would ask about me is, what do you think of the situation in Ukraine? Because whether or not they believe what they're being told by their news, they are aware, because the news talks about, quote unquote, the fake news that the West is putting out. They're aware that I might have access to that, so they want to know what I think. So they kind of came up with these witnesses and said, right, like, you've got to pay this fine, and then you can go. And I thought, right, well, £20 fine, $30, and then I can go. There's no point staying here all day. I might as well just sign the papers and go. And so I did that, but the guy who they got to translate for me, he walked out with me when we were all done. And as we were walking down the street, he said, so when they were on the phone to HQ back in Yakutsk, the capital, I overheard the people on the other end of the phone saying that these guys should pin 2 administrative offences on me so that I can be deported. And I'd resisted. I'd pushed back quite hard, saying, this is not what I'm doing. I'm not doing journalism. This is not true, or whatever. And I'm glad I did. Had I not, then they possibly would have deported me then and there. But I was free to carry on. So I carried on about another 4 weeks. Got up onto the tundra. There's some reindeer herders. Got some very remote settlements, and spent the final sort of 10 days hiking on the frozen Arctic Ocean, camping out under some of those incredible sea stars. It was beautiful, really good time. I arrived in Tixi, this port town at the end, which used to have, I think, 15,000 people. Now about 5,000 people. It's another one of these. The Russians have a phrase for this: "Khtonye," like a dying town, a town more dead than alive. And on arrival in Tixi, someone who I'd met on the road weeks earlier, who I got in touch with on arrival, he said, get in touch, we'll catch up. He told me that the FSB, KGB, wanted to talk to me. And I thought, right, well, just take the bull by the horns. I'll just go to their building. And I'll say, I hear you talk to me, I'm here. And they were a bit taken aback by that. And they said, can you come back at this time tomorrow? So I did. And they said, it felt like an interrogation, but eventually turned out it was just this standard procedure. They asked me these questions: who I was, the name of my family members, the history of my family, did any of my ancestors were they ever in the British forces, do I have any political beliefs, was I in the army, just all these kind of standard suspicious questions. And it went on about 2-3 hours, and when we were finally done, the guy said, okay, well, that's it, you're free to go. Oh, great. He said, make sure you visit the museum, there's a mammoth skeleton, have a good time, good luck to you. I went back to where I was staying, and I was recording. So I took with me a little Zoom, like a little dictaphone. A lot of people use it for podcasts, I think. And for another podcast with a friend that'll surface in a month or so, I'd been recording my experiences in my own voice along the way of the cold, the people I met, the odd conversation with other people. But naturally, with what was going on and people telling me of their opinions about Ukraine, in my own little recordings in my tent at night, sometimes I get a little sort of political, I guess. And after that encounter with the in Oostquigge, when they came to my door, these policemen the first time, 4 weeks back, when I were jumping around, when they came to my door, I was recording on my dictaphone. And I went to answer the door and just slipped it in my pocket. And they said, right, come to the police station now. And so I went, but it was still recording. So I had a live mic throughout this whole police process. And the first thing they did in the police station was take my phone, turn it off so it wasn't recording. And so little did they know there was this hot mic in my pocket. So after that was done, I got back to where I was staying. I kind of, in my own words, said what had happened, took the little micro SD card out, and then unscrewed a plug adapter, from like a British plug. Unscrewed that, wrapped the SD card up in a little scrap of white paper, slotted it in there, screwed it back up. It's like, I don't want to lose this. It's not really a huge problem, but best just to hide it, have it safe. Up in Tixi, I recorded my final thoughts again, and I had this SD card on the table. And another one, I was worried, my journal, my diary that I've been writing in each day, I was worried that might get taken, because slowly, with the villages I passed through towards the end, it was made very clear that the authorities were waiting for me in Tixi. I thought, well, that might get seized. Not the end of the world if it does. If I, with my GoPro, take a picture of every single page, and I can hide that little SD card in the same photo. But when the knock came on my door in Tixi, I'd been asleep. I'd actually fallen asleep reading the trial, this guy getting arrested and not knowing what it's all about. They came to the door and everything was kind of out. And they said, it was the police again, they said, can you come to the station for registration? I said, again, well, this is a little ominous, but registration, fine. I'd already, the day before, spoken to the FSB, I knew everything was fine. And in the station, it quickly became clear. Well, after about an hour, it's long, asking these questions, I said, well, can I go now? And they said, no, you can't go. And that's when I understood that I'm under arrest. This is maybe a little bit. And once again, they said, who have you spoken to? Who have you met in Dixie? And I said, well, I met this guy who I met on the road who... It's a small town, so I didn't want to lie to them. I thought best just to say who I'd met. So I met this guy, and I've met this other bloke, and they didn't know who either of these people were, and they were asking questions about who they were. And without leaving the room, without making a call, without doing any texting, me having just explained to them who these people were, and they didn't know who they were, they quickly said, right, well, both those people are providing witness to say that you have been conducting journalism and asking questions about Ukraine. So, they sort of essentially got me to provide them with false witnesses. And this process went on for hours. They got an English teacher to translate for us. And as the hours passed, the English teacher became more and more fed up. She was meant to be, I think someone with a disease in the town. There was a bake sale to raise money for him, and she was meant to be cooking cupcakes with her daughter that evening. And, I'd ruined this because it was already, they took me at about 4:30. Anyway, at 9:30, after a lot of waiting around, they finally said, right, you're going to court now. I thought, well, it's 9:30. How's that going to work? And they took me to another building, an old Soviet-looking apartment block-type building. But on the third floor, there was a courtroom. And in the courtroom, they got this judge who just seemed pissed off. He'd been dragged out of his home at 9:30 at night to deal with something. And the teacher was so pissed off by this point that she wasn't really translating in full anymore. So, the judge would speak a whole paragraph, and she would give me a half sentence in translation. And so the trial unfolded. I had been supposedly conducting journalism again. They had these witnesses who said I'd said this, that, and the other. And they also said, most worryingly, that I'd been photographing restricted military sites or sensitive military sites. And the judge found me guilty, and he said, you'll pay a fine. Again, not much, like $70, something like that. And you are banned from Russia for 5 years, and you have to leave. You'll be deported. And I thought, right, it's not the end of the world. It looks like Russia's not a particular place to go back to for 5 years. Fine. And so at that point, as far as I was aware, I would fly back to Yakutsk, get my own flight back to England via some other third country, and then fly home. Done. And I was taken back to my the sort of apartment I'd rented in this town. And probably 20 minutes later, there was a knock at the door. And it was the police again. They said, oh, actually, you have to be in the cell tonight. Pack everything you have up, and we're going now. And so with them in front of me, I had to pack everything up. Among the stuff that was all kind of laid out was one of these little SD cards with the second half of all the recordings from this Zoom on it. And all I could do was, I had a head torch next to it on the table, because they were watching me pack. Head torches have that little sort of hinge so it can sort of angle down on your forehead. I bent the hinge down, put the SD card in that bit and just snapped it shut and put a rubber band around the whole thing. But that just felt
I had 60 rental properties and about $10 million in real estate owned, but wait 1 minute.
You've got 242 units, $32 million in real estate.
Boom!
2,500 units, 175 million.
Boom!
220 houses, 25 million.
Boom!
About 1,500 units, 45 million.
Boom!
4,288 units, $335 million.
Boom! So I thought I was doing a lot. I had 60 rental properties and about $10 million in real estate.
Really precarious. That's not well hidden. And that's the last time I was, just before that point, was the last time I was unattended with all my stuff for weeks to come, as it turned out. I packed everything up. We were taken to the cell. I was, fingerprinting. I was eventually about 1:30 put into this little cell. And, I was thankfully tired enough. I got some sleep, woke up in the morning. And from that point onwards, I was accompanied or escorted by bailiffs, technically, although they said we're Russia's US Marshals. They were quite keen to sort of compare themselves to US Marshals. And I had already changed my flight that I had booked a week away to the following day to get me back to the capital. And so I was deported sent down to Yakutsk on the flight that I'd booked, but with a man as an escort. And at this point, I still thought, I'm free when I get to Yakutsk, I'll go home. On arrival in Yakutsk, there was another bailiff waiting for me. And he said, right, well, you have to now go and stay in this kind of hotel for foreigners until you fly home. And I thought, well, it's not ideal, but again, it's not the end of the world. And then on the drive in this minibus to the detention centre, it turned out, it was a detention centre for foreigners, and it was just a prison. And my shoelaces were taken away, my belt was taken off, all my goods were locked up in a locker, and after being processed and checked in, the cell door slammed shut behind me, and then there I am, and I don't know how long for. That's one of the sort of bleakest moments where I didn't know what exactly is going to happen after that point. I suppose, was thinking a few days and I'll probably be out. And they were sort of saying maybe 10 days. You've got to wait for the paperwork to come down from the coast or whatever. But after a few days, time had come and gone. I was in this cell. I mean, you're in the cell around the clock, 24 hours a day, not allowed outside. Food's handed through a little hatch into the cell. I shared it with 2 other men. And after a few days, they said, right, you should be getting a lawyer. And I was allowed on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays 15 minutes of access to my phone. So back home, via these frantic, hurried phone calls, my uncle and my girlfriend were kind of arranging, trying to help out. And so we arranged for a lawyer to come in, and he said, right, well, we'll appeal the decision. But that appeal wasn't heard for 2 weeks. And that appeal was dismissed out of hand. I was taken to the court. And this is after 2 weeks. By this point, I was not a happy guy. I mean, it's almost comical going to the court for the appeal. I was so desperate to get outside. I hadn't been outdoors for 2 weeks. And they said, right, you're going to the court. And I knew that meant I'd get to be outdoors for a few minutes, as I walked from the door into the minibus and from the minibus into the court at the other end. But they put me in cuffs. And then they, with another pair of handcuffs, cuffed me to one of the guards who had a taser. And there was another guard on the other side with a taser. And they wouldn't let me have my shoelaces or my belt back. And I'd lost quite a lot of weight during this trek. So my trousers were falling down. My hiking shoes had these massive sort of, tongues lolling out the front. And walking down the courthouse corridors, I was doing this kind of weird, John Wayne wide-kneed shuffle to try and stop my trousers from falling down. Meanwhile, my hands are pinned to this guy to my right. But the judge looked at the papers for, like 2 minutes and said, yeah, no, your crimes are too serious. There's a political element, and you're going back into the detention centre. And this was probably the time when I felt most low. About a week earlier, I had suddenly, unexpectedly been dragged in front of a TV camera and interviewed. And that was a bit concerning. That felt like, being tried by the court of public opinion. They had, eventually the news bit aired, I think the day before my appeal. But they had gone up to Tixie and they got witness statements from one bloke who I never even met, saying, yeah, he was talking about Ukraine and he was photographing these military sites. Again, no photos were ever provided that, backed up that story. And all the while, those first 2 weeks, all of my belongings are in their possession. And the police have come and searched. They made me turn on my phone, unlock it for them. I had a GPS device, which really freaks them out. My GoPro to them looked like a spy camera. But when they first laid out all my belongings, as some policeman, I was taken cuffed out my cell to be, to turn everything on for him. And sort of on the table, laid out in this neat little row, was all my items. And among them was this plug socket and that head torch with the hidden little SD card in it. And although technically those things weren't really incriminating, the fact that they're being hidden didn't look good. And I probably should have said earlier, back in March, 2 months earlier, they had introduced a new law with a maximum sentence of up to 15 years for journalists providing or sort of spreading fake news about the military, i.e. anyone really speaking the truth about the military.
After the invasion.
After the invasion. And, these recordings had lots of me talking about the invasion, the atrocities in Bucha and, all sorts. And my whole diary, which up to this point I'd kept hidden, because when I was checked into the cell while they were going through all my stuff, I just slipped it in my trousers. Because I thought this diary doesn't look good. I slipped it in my trousers, which, again, freaked me out a little bit. Are they going to frisk me? Are they not? I got it into the cell, and then I just hid it in plain sight among my belongings. And it was all the stuff in the locker that the police went and looked through. So there's just a lot of things going on. I'm constantly on edge that I'm just about to become, a political bargaining chip.
Did they find the SD cards?
No, thankfully. This is actually the first time I've spoken about those SD cards. And, those would have qualified me for at least, you're a journalist, if not espionage. And the guards in the prison who were... I think they were probably nice normal guys, but they were wankers to us. They kept on saying to me, are you a spy? Don't fight my country. They would also, on their phones, look up phrases in English and then kind of chant them back at me. You are a spy, Walker. And so it's a scary time. And after the appeal was rejected, I then thought, well, this could be a really long time. I could be here for months, and the longer I'm here, the more chance there is that I will find some of these SD cards, or my diary, or that they will, some ambitious, cop, some ambitious policeman or bureaucrat will decide to pick up my case again to try me under the criminal offence. Given they'd made up most of their evidence anyway, it's no stretch to think that they could pin on me the fake news journalist thing and put me away for 15 years. I didn't know that, I didn't even know of her at the time, but since getting out, I've learned about, and I'm going to get her name wrong, but Brittany Griner, the basketball player, who, we don't really even know where she is. I think a bit of news came out about her the other day, but she's clearly being, in my opinion, it's totally outrageous, but she, I think, is being held, as a prisoner swap fodder. They will use her when convenient.
Yeah, they're trying to get, there's an arms dealer that we have, and they're trying to get the arms dealer swapped for the basketball player.
Because she had a CBD vape.
Yeah.
And they arrested her like a week before the invasion even happened. They knew what was going to happen, it seems, and they just held on to her.
Yeah, she's valuable, I guess.
And I I hope that she's out as soon as possible. But I really worry about whether they'll
Held in jail for another
Another
18
18 days.
days. Yeah, but what does that mean?
Well, she's been there for over 100 days already, and
Yeah.
I mean, I was inside for not very long, but
She's
18
been-
days feels like an eternity.
Yeah, it says on drug smuggling charges until July 2nd, pushing her jail stint past the 4-month mark, according to the official state news agency TASS. How do you say that word? Kimki?
Khimki. Yeah.
Kimki Court of Moscow region granted the 18-day extension at the request of investigators. The agency quoted the court's press service as saying, "It is typical of Russian courts to extend detention repeatedly until trial." Ms. Greiner's lawyer, Alexander Boykov, could not immediately be reached for comment.
Yeah. So
Could you scroll down a little bit further? What it says that American basketball players star was arrested 4 months ago after the Russian officials said they found a vape cartridge bearing traces of hash oil in her luggage while she was passing through the Sheremetyevo Airport, Moscow's main international airport. The charge carries a jail sentence of up to 10 years. Fuck.
Yeah. I mean,
10
I
years.
really hope this proves to be correct, that it's only 18 more days. You never know with Russia. I mean, just this morning I saw on the news Navalny has essentially disappeared. They moved him to an undisclosed location.
Oh boy.
His lawyer went to visit him this morning, and when he said, where's Alexei, the prison just said, we have no convict of such a name. And that's it. That's all they said.
Can you explain who that is to people?
Sorry, yeah, Alexei Navalny is the sort of Russian opposition politician who he's been a very vocal critic and opponent of Putin for years. Boris Nemtsov was a close ally of him. He was killed by the regime. Navalny was locked up under fraud charges, I think, with a 2-year sentence. About 2 weeks ago, they added another 9 years and said that he was inciting opposition. I mean, they've gone full autocrat now.
Yeah.
There's no longer any pretense. But Navalny is the guy who was in Europe for a while, and then he flew from Germany back to Russia incredibly bravely. Many would say foolishly, but he's very dedicated to trying to liberate the Russian people from the tyranny that they're living under. He flew back knowing full well what that would mean, and that was after they had already tried to kill him with Novichok. They put Novichok in his pants in a hotel room in Berlin or something, and now he's disappeared. I think I was very lucky to be this. The fact that I'm out now at all, I think probably stems from the fact that I was all the way out there in the east, where people are a little sort of out of the loop. Had I been in Moscow, like Brittany Griner, then I think things might have been very different.
Are you worried now about talking about this openly that they might target you?
A little bit, but yes and no. I mean, the thing that I'm most mindful of is, and that's why I've probably sounded quite vague about some of the people I've essentially cited in this chat, is I need to be very careful, because being associated with me for various people in Russia could be a real problem. There's one guy who I believe is being, he was one of the witnesses used against me in one of 2 places. He's not a Russian citizen, he's from another country, and he's got in touch with me saying he's now being reported. He's lived there for 10 years. And that's I mean, it's not my fault, but it's on my head. I am not, maybe they're going to try and fuck with me. I don't plan to go back. I'm banned for 5 years anyway, but unless there's a total change of regime, not just Putin falls or is struck up from a lamppost or something and is replaced by his next mate, but like an actual perestroika again, then I won't go back. I wouldn't feel safe and probably wouldn't be safe. But equally, me being outside Russia now, talking about what's happened and also what referencing what has been happening in Ukraine, I'm the last person they care about, because there are actual journalists doing actual journalism, spreading actual news and fact about the incredible atrocities. I mean, when we flew from Tixi down to Yakut, on the flight, firstly, there were in the airport, there were banners with the letters Z everywhere, and there were a bunch of soldiers. I should say, so Tixi, it used to be a restricted zone, and then in January 2021 they sort of declassified it, and that's how my trip became viable. And I thought, okay, great, it's safe to go there now.
What's the significance of the letter Z?
So that's the, it stands for Za Pobedi, like for victory, and that's what the Russians have on their tanks, Z and V. So they the tanks that have driven across into Ukraine, they've all got the letter Z marked out on them in paint or tape. But all over Russia, you'll see now cars or trucks or buses with Z on them. It's this mark of Russian pride in the special operation that's being undertaken in Ukraine, the invasion. But all these soldiers on this flight, they were sort of in their 40s. Looked, judging by their age and sort of epaulets and stars all over them, it looked like they're probably relatively senior personnel. And sitting on that flight was weird. I was thinking, if they're flying from here, maybe some of them will be deployed to Ukraine. And if they're deployed to Ukraine, maybe some of these guys will be sanctioning or at least turning a blind eye to rape and murder and torture in the weeks to come. But Tixi itself, even as they were declassifying it, they installed a bunch of missile silos, surface air missile silos outside the town, which I wasn't aware of. So it's Russia's huge Arctic coast. It's like 12,000 miles of sort of frontier, and they've got 3 points ranged along it that are the kind of hubs of they call it the ice curtain, their Arctic defense strategy. And Tixi is one of those. So they've, in the last few years, massively ramped up their military personnel there, their military hardware. So, that's to defend against any attacks from the north by sea or air or whatever. And so that, was, I guess, why they were particularly on edge about me being there and this idea of photographing the military, which, again, I hadn't been, but that was why they sort of summoned that.
So how did they eventually let you go, and why?
So they, when they've got foreigners in this detention center, to deport you, they've got to take you to Moscow first, because there's no international airport in Yakutsk. And to do that, they're being taken to Moscow involves handcuffs and guards, and it's like this whole big rigmarole. They do it on the state budget. You have no say over when it happens, so you just have to wait. And for the other, I think there were no more than about 12 people in this detention centre. There were only 5 cells. For the other people there, that's just a case of just waiting. And they were basically all undocumented workers, so people who had either outstayed their work visa or never had one. And they most of them seemed fairly stoical about it, although some of them had been there for... I didn't get to talk to many because I was in a cell with 2 for 2 weeks and then by myself for 2 weeks after that. But I think the longest any of them were there were probably about 6 weeks, except one Ukrainian guy who had been given a 6-month sentence there. He had been in a prison for 2.5 years beforehand for some criminal offence that he wouldn't tell me what, so I don't really know what his story was. But they deport you when the next sort of deportation run happens to be booked up. And very last minute, on the 16th, I think, of May, when I'd been inside nearly 4 weeks, they said, right, on Wednesday, 2 days from now, if you can book flights to coincide with this deportation that we're doing of 3 other people, then you can go with it. And so, hurriedly, I got my wonderful girlfriend to arrange flights so that I could fly with them on this flight to Moscow. And from there, I would then, as far as they told me, I would go through customs and immigration, and then I'd be in the departures lounge, and I'm sort of essentially out of Russia and then free to go. So we arranged this flight, and I was taken with them. And that was, a huge relief. Finally, I'm moving, I'm getting out of here. Had it not worked out that time, they gave me a COVID test. Had I been positive for COVID, had we managed to not get the flight, had there been no seats left on the plane, then I would have had to wait for the next one, which they told me was going to be sort of late July, so another 2 months or so. So thankfully we got tickets. I got on that flight, knocked them in handcuffed again. 5 bailiffs escorting the 4 of us prisoners. They took us to Moscow to show them the other airport, the same airport where Brittany Griner was arrested. And we were then put into a small room to wait for our respective check-in times for our different flights. Me to London via Dubai with Emirates, a guy to Armenia, a guy to Uzbekistan, and another fella to Kyrgyzstan. Finally they said, right, it's your time to check in. I went and got my bag checked in. Was taken through sort of security and immigration by a SWAT team, well, 2 persons SWAT team with a bunch of police. There was like a whole gang of people. Finally got through, and they gave me my passport back and my phone back and said, right, now. And I was like, great, this is it, I'm free. And they said, right, just wait here a minute. And then suddenly I was taken through this extra layer of security that I hadn't expected. And there were about 6 cops who didn't know who I was. They'd been given, I guess, a 1 sheet, or a little stack of papers saying about my case. And they basically were just giving me and all my bags and just, my backpack. Again, I haven't been left unsupervised with all my stuff at any point. And so suddenly they had all my possessions, including that head torch, including the plug socket, including my diary, which they got their hands on. And for an hour and a half, they just went over everything. They went through all the phone conversations. They went back on my phone through photos for years. Eventually, they came across a picture of me from 10 years earlier in Afghanistan with a big beard, a sort of headscarf, and an AK-47 in the desert, which really didn't help. And it was totally innocent picture. I've been cycling along one of the Afghan National Army soldiers, good guys, at a road checkpoint, inviting him for tea. And their hobbies are kind of drinking tea and taking pictures with guns in the desert. They kept pulling up things on my phone saying, what's this for? They found my diary. This is the first time someone got their hands on my diary, and they started reading through, speaking decent English, reading through stuff. And I, thankfully, in the prison had censored a bunch of stuff I'd gone through, and I'd scrubbed things out. I'd big black marks all over the place. For instance, it's a diary day by day, given the date. The 3rd day in big block capitals, it said at the top, Russia invades Ukraine. It's like, scrub that out. There was a wealth of stuff. Had they really looked closely, that would probably still be visible, or you turn it over on the back, you can see where the pen mark is pressed, the impressions. There was just a wealth of stuff there that they could have, locked me up for. And this is now in Moscow, where it just felt more serious. And this process went on for ages. They were asking me loads of questions, and I started to realise, in my mind, I was realising, that's it. Like, this is, it's just got, we're back to square one, but worse. And my flight time was sort of ticking slowly closer, and they showed no sign of letting me go. And I was like, I'm going to get my flight soon. And they started looking through just all the pictures on my camera, And I mean, they were also going to like personal conversations on WhatsApp on my phone, and like it was a really my girlfriend, who I just texted when I got my phone back, saying, you know, I've got my phone, it's all done, it's all over. She then was trying to reply and call me, and the messages were marked as read. The calls were just getting hung up each time, so she was freaking out. Suddenly, like I say, I'm free, and suddenly it seems I don't have access to my phone, and I'm in Moscow. So this went on for an hour and a half, during which, it's like in Russia, everyone shits on whoever's below them. You know, so all these people were trying to intimidate the shit out of me. And they were saying, okay, well, you know, you've got to wipe your phone, you've got to wipe every photo that you have on your camera. And I like, you know, if it came to it, I'd be willing to do that, but I didn't want to, because I also want to have some record of this journey I've been on, which was great until I was arrested. And it started to feel like I'm about to get locked up. This is it. And it's either going to be espionage or journalism, you know, fake news journalism, and I'm going to be here for years. You know, there's a British woman who got locked up for basically the same thing in Iran and was behind bars for 6 years. And you know, it wasn't helped by the fact that Boris Johnson, now the Prime Minister, was Foreign Secretary at the time, and he said publicly, "Oh, she's just teaching people journalism. It's fine." She was there. You know, she's a Iranian British dual national. She was there visiting her family, so that like didn't help. And she became a bargaining chip with the British government. Basically, the British had a sort of £240 million unpaid debt. They had, before the Shah was deposed, they had taken money for £240 million worth of money for some tanks. But after the Iranian Revolution, the Islamic Revolution, the British just didn't deliver the tanks and held the money. So it was actually like a fair grievance, to be honest. But she was held until eventually that was agreed to be paid. So it was a very like naked bargaining chip thing. And that was totally forefront of my mind. Like this is, you know, the amount of sanctions, the amount of, you know, things that Britain is doing at the moment to sort of hinder Russia and to aid Ukraine. Like I could be pretty useful. And then just as my flight was, you know, like about to take off, they suddenly said, right, pack everything up, and they ran me through the departures now, at a run, to the gate where they were clearly waiting for me. So I got on the plane. You know, the last soldier was gone behind me. The doors shut. The plane took off, and the minute those wheels took off, I just broke down. Like floods of tears. It was the first time in the whole like, you know, long month.
Dude, I'm freaking out, and you're here.
I know. Well, like, so this morning, like, you know, I thought, having this chat with you, I should probably read through my like diary, because in prison I was allowed pen and paper. So on little scraps of paper, keeping them all sort of separate, I wrote what was happening day to day. And this morning I was reading through it, and it got me on edge again. You know, I was like freaking out because it just brought back that sense of insecurity. You know, being in this cell writing stuff, there are cameras in the ceiling, you're always watched. You never know who's watching. You never know who's going to next go and look through your stuff. It just, you know, it scared the shit out of me.
Jesus Christ, man.
Sorry, I think I relayed all that quite scattily because, you know,
no, it was amazing. It was
hard to kind of tell it chronologically, I guess.
It's all interesting.
Oh yeah. If you ever find yourself in prison and you need some dice, you can make them with bread and toothpaste for the dots.
Oh, this is bread?
Yeah, this is bread. If you take the crust off and just kind of knead the flesh of the bread kind of back into dough, add a bit of water, it becomes quite sort of you know, versatile. Although the one that we're looking at now with the 6, it turns out that's a kind of a bent die. That rolls a 6 pretty much every time. But the other ones were pretty equal, and I had time to like with each of them I rolled them like 300 times to like tally what they came up. You know, just anything to kill time. So one of those dice was almost perfectly fair. One of them was all right. The one with that 6 was not good.
And were you gambling with people?
No, not gambling. I mean, we had so I was the only one who didn't smoke. I'm a non-smoker, and 2 other guys in the cell smoking. It wasn't ideal, but they quickly. This is the first 2 weeks when I had cellmates. They quickly ran out of cigarettes and started smoking tea. You know, they would like tear open tea bags and sprinkle the tea into a page ripped out of a Russian sort of pulp fiction novel, which you know was kind of desperate times for them.
How bizarre.
No, we didn't gamble, but we made a drafts or checkers board using, you know, the kind of the paper toggle that you hold when you're dipping a tea bag. There were 2 different colours of those. You know, tea and bread was about half the diet. So we got a bunch of those that we could use as drafts or checkers. And those guys, I don't actually know how to play backgammon, but they set up a backgammon board for themselves using dice. You find ways to kill time, but mostly it was books. Thankfully, a local friend and the lawyer that I hired were allowed to deliver me some English language books, which so I didn't get them immediately. So in the course of probably about 23 days, I tallied up. I read 7,000 pages plus of books, just reading. I mean, whatever I could get hold of. Some of which wasn't great, some was fantastic. I did a lot of sort of sit-ups and push-ups. My last day I did 700 sit-ups. I mean, it's all gone now. You know, I've been back and I've been living well / badly since I got home. But yeah, just anything to kill time.
Well, no one can fault you for that. God damn, man, that must have been a harrowing experience. Do you still have nightmares about it?
I've never had nightmares about it, but I have had once or twice since I got back when I've woken up sort of thinking that I'm still there. Which, I mean, when I was inside for the first week or so, I'd wake up every morning thinking I was elsewhere. And almost the most depressing thing was the first morning when I woke up and I wasn't at all surprised to be in Britain. You know, that's a bit shitty. But I don't really dream. I very rarely remember any dreams / nightmares. So thankfully, that hasn't been a problem. I think I'm more or less all right. Maybe I'm very British. I'm probably just like compacting all my trauma and burying it. I also spent 10 years at boarding school. It's quite good training for prison, I guess. And had just been, living outdoors in super cold temperatures for a while. So I guess the novelty of being inside with like running water and food brought to you, even though it wasn't great food. I think I was quite good at trying to see the bright side. And I've put myself through quite a lot of stresses in the past, and I'm probably fairly resilient to things like this, but it's definitely left a mark. I'm sure I'll be. It's recent. I got out like 3 weeks ago, so I'm still, I guess, sort of picking over it in my mind.
Have you started to write about it?
I wrote an article for the Sunday Times that went out about a week ago, and that was a really good sort of cathartic process, like going through it all, reading over stuff, and just trying to like process it formally as opposed to just vague thoughts drifting about. But I will start shortly work on a book about it, about the whole trip, not just about this prison. Because frankly, the prison time, it's quite dramatic, but it was largely just very boring, frightening, and frustrating.
Was it disturbing seeing the effectiveness of the propaganda on the populace? I mean, that seems to be
the most disturbing thing.
Yeah.
After about 10 days, the TV was put into our cell, which for about 30 seconds I thought, this is great, something to distract. And then I immediately realised this is going to be blaring loud, crap Russian TV shows around the clock. Very cool. I was very glad to then, a few days later, we put it in a cell. But that meant that I, had like daily access to the propaganda, when the war was sort of 3 months in. And I mean, it's insane. They're obsessed with this idea that the government has sold this idea, the Kremlin, that it's liberating people from Nazism. And I think that's because, throughout the whole Soviet era, the Soviet sort of state's founding myth was the Bolshevik Revolution, and that slowly changed because I think Putin is slowly kind of removing or sort of diminishing Lenin's reputation. He's actually starting to try and sort of rehabilitate Stalin's reputation, which is astounding, frankly. But the founding myth, essentially, myth's not fair. The founding story of the Russian Federation now is basically the Second World War, or the Great Patriotic War, as they call it, in which so many millions of Russians died.
How is he trying to rehabilitate Stalin's image?
In Russia you can rewrite the history books. It's that simple.
And they don't have general access to the internet, right?
The internet is heavily sort of censored, and more. When I arrived, there was Instagram, Twitter, and whatever. And as soon as the invasion happened, they cut Twitter. They cut or just severely restricted the bandwidth to, I think, Instagram. But lots of people have VPNs to find ways around it.
Are VPNs effective in that regard? Can you use them?
I didn't use them, but I saw loads of people using them. They're always effective. I think.
For people who don't know what we're talking about, virtual private network. You can use them to pretend you're in a different country. You can use them to access different parts of the internet that might be restricted.
Exactly. So the Second World War is this kind of foundational story. So many millions of people died, and it's the great triumph of Russia to have been so instrumental in Nazis. And Russia was incredibly instrumental. The Eastern Front, the war back then for Ukraine in particular, Stalingrad. This was like untold numbers of deaths. It way outnumbers the Western Front, even with the Dunkirk, the D-Day landing. And so Russia sees, its noble defeat of Nazism and repression and fascism as its kind of almost its national raison d'etre, its reason to be. And the news was just covered in like grainy old footage from the Second World War. And they'd got a few little clips from. Are you aware of the Azov Battalion?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So
those are the Nazis, but it's a different kind of. The concept of Nazism is different, right?
Yeah.
It's more of a nationalism than it is like an anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic Nazism.
Yeah, and I'm definitely not an expert.
Am I right about that?
Yeah, that's pretty much it. But that was the Azov Battalion's roots, at least, and I guess sort of white nationalism.
Are they using swastikas?
They've got their own sort of take on it. It's a sort of slightly swastika-esque symbol, I guess.
What is it? Can we see what that looks like?
It's a kind of a yellow and black type symbol, I think.
But why? How is it correlated with Nazism?
So, the Azov Battalion's root, and you'll probably be able to pull up better information than I'm able to sort of summon from my slightly sketchy memory. But their roots were a while ago, and they did have this kind of line of extremism, I guess. But that's changed a lot. So there you go. Yeah, there's definitely a swastika inspiration to that.
Yeah, similar.
But they've
it also looks like when they find utilities. Like when they draw that thing on the street.
Oh yeah.
You know what I'm talking about?
Guess what?
Yeah, when they spray paint lines on the street where the lines are.
Also, you flip it on its side next to it, as I said.
Yeah, right.
But they, I think I'm right in saying that with the invasion, the annexation of Crimea in 2014, the Azov Battalion sort of broadened, and other people joined, and that kind of element was, constricted and became, had a diminishing role. However, there is out there online from a long time ago, so there's plenty of Azov Battalion propaganda, people marching. There's the odd sort of Sieg Heil, Hitler saluting. And that stuff has all been dredged up and is just put all over the place, as well as other footage, kind of grainy video phone film footage that claims to be, I'm pretty sure it wasn't, members of the Azov Battalion just beating up strangers on the street, just random violent attacks. But they just ram all this down the throats of the public. And it does seem like the vast, after Putin invaded, his popularity within Russia soared. Really? Yeah. I think there's been some changes there. There have been a few brief, high-profile people speaking out, they quickly get arrested or whatever. And there were initially protests across the country within the first 2 or 3 days of the war. Something like 15,000 people were arrested. And so quickly dissent got kind of quashed. And in my admittedly limited experience of an admittedly niche, far, remote part of Russia, it seemed like plenty of people, and I have to be very careful about generalizations here, but it seemed like plenty of people either realised that it's bullshit and they're being lied to, or were, had their doubts. It's just, understandably, no one's putting their head above the parapet and saying this, because there's nothing to gain. It's,
right.
If you speak out, you're going to get in trouble, or your family are going to get in trouble, and trouble can mean years in prison, or in basically the gulag. They've still got labour camps, labour prisons, penal colonies, they call them, dotted around the country. And so, people understandably are just keeping their heads down and getting on with life. And it's been weird since coming back, because, I had, and to some extent still have, this massive hole in my knowledge of what's going on with the war, because I didn't have phone service while I was out in the wild, and then very quickly I was, even in Tikti, there was no Wi-Fi anywhere. And very quickly I was suddenly banged up in a prison without access, brief phone calls to try and manage my, my appeal or logistics, whatever, but never any, looking at the news. And getting out, it's been very interesting seeing this kind of, firstly, the incredible and totally worthwhile, noble, support of Ukraine. And it's been great to see that at a public level, at a state level, and long may that continue. And maybe we'll talk a bit about the future in a minute. But also there's this slightly worrying kind of general Russophobia that has me a little bit uncomfortable, because at the beginning of the war, it was very much billed in Western media, at least, as one man's mad war. Putin's crazy sort of, crusade to try and write himself in the history books and claim back what he saw as Russian lands. And slowly that narrative seems to have changed to the point where, with some of the, there's companies who, I think McDonald's, for instance, leaving Russia, I think that's the right thing to do. And just 2 days ago, all the McDonald's restaurants are reopened under the new branding, Vkuzna i Tolka, which is tasty, and that's it.
That's the new name?
Yeah.
So they just basically took their McDonald's
stores
and
selling
just
all the same shit.
Say the same thing.
The secret ingredients won't be there. But then there's also, just like Russian people or companies that have no connection to to the state. It seems have been experiencing quite a lot of hardship as well.
The Russian athletes.
Yeah, particularly. Wimbledon's a very good example. I totally disagree with the idea of Russian tennis players being banned from playing at Wimbledon. And I think it's right that Wimbledon is not counting as a sort of a tennis rankings tournament this year.
There was criticism of Canelo Alvarez boxing against Bivol.
Right. These are athletes. The Olympics is slightly different when you're representing a country and there's a sort of state-sponsored doping program that's been going on for years. But like tennis players who are individuals, you don't play tennis for your country, you play tennis for yourself. You don't box for your country, unless it's Rocky IV. You box for yourself. And I have a slight, I don't feel good about some of these sort of things that happen.
Yeah, I share that concern.
Yeah.
It's actually made its way into billions. There's a man named Fedor Gorst who's a top-level pool player, and there's people that want him banned from tournaments.
That just seems vindictive. Frankly.
Well, it just seems ignorant.
If you're just a Russian sports person who's keeping their head down, that's unfair. If you're someone who's up the regime, this is great. Let's go, good old Putin. Like there was some male Russian gymnast recently, I think, who used a podium place to form a letter Z or something. I'm not entirely sure. That's a bit different. People showing sort of public support and essentially, releasing propaganda. That's a different thing. But if you're just a sports person, then
Well, it's fascinating how many athletes come out of Ukraine, how many great boxers have come out of Ukraine. The Klitschko brothers, of course, one of them is the mayor, which is really insane.
Yeah.
And also, Lomachenko, there's quite a few elite boxers.
it's a massive country.
Yeah.
I think for a long time I chose to forget just how large the portion of it is, particularly grain and chemical exports. How all these things that they produce and farm whatever there, as well as the human exports. I think there's some
So for the 3 weeks since you've been out, have you been playing catch up, trying to absorb as much media as possible and get a sort of an objective understanding of what's happening over there?
Yeah, I've been trying my best to. It is difficult with just checking the news and I'm sure there'll be things that over the coming months that come out I had no idea about. It's massive news for a day or two. If I'd been in over the period that these 2 British and 1 Moroccan citizens were recently sentenced to death in Donetsk for having fought with they were all in the Ukrainian forces before the invasion anyway, but they've been tried and found guilty and given the death sentence for being mercenaries. If something like that happened, briefly while I was inside, then that news pops up and then disappears again quite quickly, and that's the stuff I might not know. But actually, the best solution to that I found is by trawling through podcasts from the period that I was in, news outlets and various discussions. That's been quite a good way to stop the gap.
It seems like in your recovery from prison and dealing with just the psychological stress and then absorbing all this information, I mean, that has to be taking up a gigantic portion of your life. Is it difficult to get back on track and try to have a semblance of normalcy?
It's been a really flat out time since I got back. Also, a bunch of friends are all getting married this summer, so I'm sort of darting around all over the place. This month I've literally got 4 weddings and a funeral. It's a busy time just socially as well. It's summer, and it's nice to be out and to be normal again.
God, it must be nice.
But I feel I have to point out that although what happened to me was psychologically quite frightening, firstly, I was never abused or abused or starved or anything like that. The soldiers were sometimes pricks, but that's not a big deal. Secondly, what's happened to me is, in the grand scheme of things, totally insignificant and irrelevant, and I still owe a bomb and lost a family member. I think, if anything, I would like my experiences to highlight the extent to which Russia is gone as a functioning state. And we knew it wasn't functioning democracy, but it's post-truth. It's a state where it doesn't matter if Putin lies. You can be, Russian. I'm going to get this stat wrong, maybe not be able to pull it up, but of cases that go to court in Russia, I think the latest statistic is 99.97, or 99.7 perhaps, % of cases end in a guilty verdict. If you're accused of something in Russia, you are guilty. That's it. There's no dispute. And it's not a country. I would advise no one to go there. It's not safe to be a foreigner, particularly if you're from one of the NATO or Western countries.
That is wild.
It's lost. As a country, it's lost. We're back to the kind of the bad old days.
There was discussion about fights taking place in Russia, and I think we might have done a UFC in Moscow. I think we did. I think there was a UFC in Moscow. See if that's the case.
UFC's huge there.
Yeah, but they had one of the greatest heavyweight champions ever in Fyodor Emelianenko. Yeah, Fight Night 163, and Zabit. Yeah, Zabit Magomed Shapirov, who's one of the top flight guys. Sharapov, excuse me. I know he's fucking name up. Magomed Sharapov versus Calvin Kattar, which is a great fight that took place in Russia. So this was, when was this? 2019, yeah.
Did you go over that?
I did not. I don't do the fight nights, but there was discussion of doing a major event over there, and whenever there's a major event, I get tempted to going just to see. There's a few places I've never experienced. I've never experienced Moscow, and I think the architecture is spectacular, and I'd be interested in just seeing what it's like over there. And
unfortunately, you're being actually a gift to the authorities. I would
to arrest me.
Yeah. Particularly, I suppose you're publicly an advocate of something that's very much banned in Russia.
Oh yeah, all of them.
And they will swab every inch of you.
They'll find some stuff, I'm sure. We'll just testing.
Or they'll just say that.
Yes.
That's the thing. It doesn't have to be true.
That's what I've heard about this basketball player
woman,
Brittany Griner, that they believe that they might have even planted these things or lied about what's in there. I don't have any desire to go over there now, but back then I was tempted because I'm just curious about the experience of going to these places.
It is a fascinating place. It's got an incredible history, and I think the history is what has drawn me there a lot. I've been a few times in the last few years, and it's basically a morbid curiosity. Russia's history is just a relentless parade of shit.
Yeah.
It's just the people, the deaths are counted by the sort of vague estimated millions as opposed to precise numbers. It's scored more own goals in history than any other country, surely. They really have fucked themselves over a lot of times in a lot of ways. And this is frankly what
is the expression are you saying? Scored more what?
Own goals. Oh, so in football, in soccer, if you kick the ball in, your goal by mistake.
Right.
Yeah. And I think this is part of what I've historically admired about Russian people that I've met as well, is that they are just incredibly stoical. It's like they're almost born to suffer and just put up with crap in a very staunch, almost admirable way, and I do find that admirable. and I can somewhat relate to it because I've over the years put myself through a lot of, unnecessarily put myself through a lot of like difficult times, but I guess the feeling of kinship has faded somewhat.
Yeah, I just I wonder if at all if this is going to relax to the point where travel is going to be possible again.
Well, that's
I
the
don't
next thing,
yeah.
how long does this go on? I think
Right.
I think years.
You think years?
Well, so the big question at the moment, Zelensky is, unfortunately, and in fact, I would like to say this now, a month on the inside, I can now say Slava Ukraine, victory of the Ukrainian people. I'm totally fine. But Zelensky's in this impossible situation where it's going to be very, very hard to completely defeat and repel the Russian forces beyond, out of the Donbass, and even Crimea. But he has to politically say, I'm not giving up, I'm not making any concessions of land. We fight until we restore our sort of sovereign border of Ukraine. And if he were to make some peace deal with the Russians that conceded territory, it could possibly be outright straight away. And that gives the chance of Moscow to try and serve a puppet candidate. That's a problem. But more importantly, with Russia, we've seen this over the last years now. If you give them an inch, they'll take a mile. If the pushback isn't hard enough and they are allowed to occupy and set up their two puppet states in the Donbass, then they've got that, and next it'll be more or Estonia or Latvia or even Finland. And it's where does it stop? It has to stop somewhere. Making peace and allowing them to have some of the territory of Ukraine is causing rather than solving the problem. And I feel like it's better off just fixing this problem now, but it's going to be a long, winding, unpleasant solution, and who knows how long it'll take or what the outcome will be. I'm not far-sighted, I'm not clairvoyant, but
nobody seems to have like a real clear understanding of how this could ever possibly play out in a positive way.
Yeah, there are people who, and I don't know entirely if I agree with this, but there are certain commentators who are saying that the war in Ukraine grinding on for a long time is, from the kind of NATO perspective, sort of the ideal scenario, because Russia just gets weakened. The tens of thousands of troops they've lost, no one knows. It's an official secret. No one in Russia knows. But they are losing so many people, so much hardware. Their economy is actually doing fine because all the price of export of natural, fossil fuels is shot up, and they're still exporting just as much as they ever have. So they're actually not feeling economically that much strain yet. But that's to come, I think. But the longer it goes on, the more weakened Russia becomes, and that's sort of ideal from the standpoint of the opponents of Russia. But it's horrific for the Ukrainian people, who essentially are the sort of cannon fodder to that end. And
there's always the looming threat that he uses a nuke.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. That's the fault with nuclear weapons in the first place.
Right.
It doesn't make sense. But he probably just about is mad enough, and everyone thought that he was like bluffing this whole time. But it does seem like he's genuinely mad. And if a lot of people, there's a lot of sort of conspiracy theory around, I suppose, about his health, and perhaps he's got bone cancer. Or
Oliver
cancer,
Stone said that he was being treated for cancer when he went to visit him and have interviews with him, which was a few years ago.
Right.
Oliver was over there, and did you ever see that? He showed him Dr. Strangelove. Yeah, which is wild, right? Because Dr. Strangelove is all about a bunch of mad people deciding to use the bomb and conceding that we'll lose a couple million here or there, but it's no big deal. And essentially was about real discussions that were being had during the 1950s and 60s by several generals who thought it would be a good idea to preemptively attack Russia and preemptively attack China with nuclear weapons.
What was Putin's take on this film? Do we know?
Oliver Stone was on here and he talked about it. We actually we looked at photographs of him and videos of him showing the Dr. Strangelove film to Putin. And, I think he was probably paying lip service to the dangers of nuclear weapons and this and that. But, he's already used hypersonic weapons. And I think in many ways that...
and those hyperbaric ones that suck all the oxygen out of the city. It's horrific.
Yeah, it's horrific.
But if he was mad enough to begin this invasion, which there's no logic to it,
right? And
there's no whatever outcome, he still loses,
right?
Like Russia has massively isolated itself, and it's for the prosperity of Russia as a whole and its kind of integration. I know that China is still kind of there on the fence, but if you put together the kind of the European bloc and America and Canada and all these other countries who are on the sort of the liberal side. That's much more important, economically. Russia has totally shot itself in the foot. And so he is clearly mad enough to make a move that stupid. So potentially he is mad enough to launch a nuclear missile.
Well, particularly if he's really fatally sick. If that really is happening and he really doesn't have anything to lose. My friend Lex Friedman, who is Russian, he does not think that's going to happen because he thinks that Putin wants to have a legacy of benefiting Russia, and that if he does die, and if he is dying, that he wants to have something in his legacy that shows that he was of benefit to Russia, that he's very committed to this idea of his legacy.
I think he probably only sees that in territorial terms. So 4 or 5 days ago was the 350th birthday of Peter the Great, who was a Romanov Tsar who massively expanded Russia's territory. And Putin said in a sort of public celebration and speech, he said, I see myself as picking up where Peter left off in reclaiming Russian territory. Peter conquered Finland from the Swedes, so the Finns must be terrified. But I genuinely think he sees it as restoring Russia to its greatest extent, which was the Soviet Empire. And lots of people within Russia, normal people, think that, the Ukrainians, the Latvians, the Uzbeks, all these people are their kind of national brethren and that they belong under the mantle of Russia.
That's what's terrifying, right? That there's a precedent. That there's some sort of a rationalization for him acquiring these countries again.
But Russia is in itself a massive imperial project. It's an empire. It's still an empire today. Where I was has no right being ruled by Moscow. It doesn't really make any sense. And he's picked his time. The greatest extent of Russian empire. That's where it should be again. But one of the, I think possibly the Kenyan prime minister or foreign minister, or no, I think it was the Kenya's ambassador to the UN a few weeks ago said, look, we can't all just hark back to some colonial era and, Kenya could dispute borders with Tanzania, or Britain could suddenly go mad again and say, we want to paint the map pink and, reconquer all the world. And it's totally, it's just a failed project. But, he's not going to listen to that.
Yeah, and also there's a fear that China is watching this and contemplating whether or not to invade Taiwan. Yeah.
Yeah, we've already seen Hong Kong lost in the last couple of years. That's, as far as I'm
completely
concerned.
lost. Gone from being European ruled in the 1990s and to kind of mostly maintaining that sort of tradition, and now recently gone full totalitarianism.
Well, the deal on the handover in 97 was that the laws and the autonomy of Hong Kong remains inviolate for 50 years after the handover. So that would be 2047, but it's already gone. They've upped the timetable. Yeah. And it's not with China and Taiwan. I fear it's not a case of if, it's a case of when. Thankfully, the West's reaction to, they haven't just turned a blind eye to Ukraine. And so China probably will be thinking, this is not going to be easy. The world's not just going to roll over and let us conquer Taiwan, which is, one of the world's most sort of healthy functioning democracies.
Yeah, I've read there was some speculation about China economically divesting in the West, and that they're going to liquidate assets, and they're doing this so that to mitigate the amount of impact it would have if they're sanctioned for invading Taiwan.
I hadn't heard that. That's very worrying.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I was reading about that, but I don't understand economics enough to really speculate whether or not that's accurate, or whether or not this person has a valid point. It's just the whole thing is so tense, and it didn't. 5 years ago, there was no fear at all. 5 years ago, it was like everything was like, look at this 2019 event that they were having in Moscow, where I was like, ooh, maybe I'd like to go there. Maybe that'd be interesting. I'm just fascinated in the architecture. When you look at Moscow, like
the metro in particular, each metro station is like an artwork. It's like a sort of a totally different architecture in each one. They're really, really impressive.
It's also so unique. Like their architecture is so uniquely Russian.
Yeah.
Like when you look at what's going, like the just the colors and the beautiful buildings in Moscow.
And sort of 19th century. I know now we build bigger buildings, but from a 19th century perspective, monumental architecture, huge buildings, big, long, organized projects, streets that are. Wow. Yeah, look at this. It's incredible.
Look at that. That's incredible.
And each station is totally different. They are really, really impressive.
Well, they're such impressive people. What they've done with chess, what they've done with literature, what they've done with, particularly with martial arts. They have some of the most dominant fighters in the history of the sport have come out of Russia, particularly in MMA, but in boxing as well, and wrestling. There's just so many incredible athletes that have come out of that system, and obviously there's a intense amount of corruption and cheating involved too. Have you ever seen the documentary Icarus?
Yeah.
It was just a great documentary to understand the extent of their cheating in international competition.
Yeah, it's also a massive population. I think about 144 million people. And although it's, their national average income is pretty woeful. It's. I think the now outmoded terms first world and third world.
Yeah.
The second world was the Soviet Union. I didn't know that until recently. So they're they're neither here nor there. And that's still sort of the case. And of course, you've got the incredible wealth of kind of oligarchs and the kind of kleptocracy in Moscow. But the vast majority of Russian people don't have a great deal. They really aren't very wealthy, but they are very literate. They're relatively well educated, even if some of the history they're taught is the social cobblers. And so they they have an incredibly large population from which to to excel at all sorts of things, science as well.
I wanted to talk to you about the oligarchs, because one of the things that I found fascinating about this, and I have all sorts of questions, is once they started taking yachts and real estate away from I didn't totally understand why A, they were able to do that, or B, why everybody was in support of that. Is there a direct connection between these oligarchs and either supporting Putin or financing Putin, or what?
I think, and again, I'm not totally across this, but my understanding is that you basically can't be an oligarch in Russia unless you kind of have Putin's blessing. There have been various, as Putin came to power and then slowly became more powerful, there are various oligarchs who sort of, tried to rival him for power. Berezovsky, this media mogul. There were a few, and they were slowly just kind of removed or defeated.
Yeah.
And so the idea is that if you're an oligarch, you probably have the blessing of Putin, and therefore potentially your wealth might be at his disposal, or you're in his pocket. Or also, frankly, people who are multi-billionaires in Russia, it's a corrupt state. No one's making that money completely legitimately, and there's that element. But with seizing it and who's having their assets seized, it does seem quite complicated, and it does seem like they just spread quite a wide net to start off with. But again, this was happening while I was kind of out of the loop, so I'm not all that keyed in. I'm quickly going to run to the toilet, if that's right. The restroom.
We could wrap this up unless you want to keep going. Keep
well,
going?
Up to you. I'm easy.
Do you have more to talk about? I bet you do. Go take a leak.
All right.
We'll see you in a couple of minutes.
I guess the one thing that we haven't spoken about that we could is Papua New Guinea. Probably the most bizarre country I've ever been to.
Did you experience any cannibalism?
I met people who remembered those times, but cannibalism, it seems, is gone.
Yeah.
So since the 70s, really.
What about the Seaman Warriors?
Seaman Warriors?
You don't know about that?
Oh, I'd like to hear about that.
Oh my goodness. One of the most bizarre practices that I've read about from New Guinea is the ritual abuse of young boys they get at an early age taken in by older men. And they're told that in order to grow strong, they need the semen of older men, and they ingest it orally and anally. See if you can find this. And this has been going on for, I don't know how long, but it's one of the most bizarre practices, because it's like a ritualistic abuse and sexual abuse of young boys. Samian tribe's rite of passage that requires young boys to drink semen if they want to transition to adulthood. And it's not just semen drinking. It's like they call the father, they call them anal fathers. It's very strange stuff.
And this is ongoing.
Yes. According to demands of this custom, semen is thought to have some sort of a masculine spirit, and young boys can only possess the spirit by drinking it. It's a custom believed to be a huge proof of masculinity and strength. Over the years, different meanings have been ascribed to the semen ritual. Some people have even tagged it as a form of ritualized homosexuality. Usually the young lads are not allowed to make a voluntary decision, but are simply threatened by the older men to partake in various activities in an effort to prove their masculinity. Surprisingly, the Sambia tribe considers the ingestion of semen to be a compulsory ritual for male development. For them, it is preferable for young boys to be seen as warriors than to be judged weaklings.
A lot of cultures do some weird shit for rites of passage. That's out there.
This is fucking out there. And they take them in very young. They take them in when they're like 6 years old.
There's also... they used to have and this thankfully is gone now, but they used to have the custom, just of headhunters, and your basically rite of passage is to kill another man, which I think is, as bizarre as this is, I think that's kind of even weirder, because this is pretty fucked up. It's relatively low stakes. I guess there's quite a lot of psychological harm potentially. But this doesn't, it shocks me, but it doesn't hugely surprise me.
Stop scrolling. Scroll back. Read this here. After the boys are removed from their mothers, they're then flogged with long sticks during a bloodletting ceremony. The elders kickstart the blood purification ritual by inserting 2 canes in the nostrils of the new initiates until they vomit blood. Each boy is held against a tree, and sticks and sharp grasses are shoved up his nose. During the process, the elders continuously poke the throats of the boys with an arrow-like object until they vomit any contaminating influence within them. Once the nose poking is done, the blood starts falling from the nose. The elders make a collective war cry. This is then followed by more beatings with the aim of toughening the boys so they can be powerful warriors. While a lot of people would view the nose poking as extremely painful and intrusive exercise, the Sambia see it as a display of endurance and strength. Once the bloodletting ceremony is over, the young boys are made to perform fellatio on the older boys. After ingesting the semen, also known as male milk, It is expected that it will help the boys grow stronger due to the presence of a substance called jurungdu within it. Apart from taking in semen, the new initiates are forced to observe a strict diet that will give them strength. If you scroll back where we were before, though, it talks about the mothers. Yeah.
Until the blowjobs, this kind of sounded like a Spartan take on an ayahuasca ceremony.
Right, but it's also they're removed from their mothers because they okay. Scroll up, keep going up there. Yeah, the reason for detaching the boys because the tribe considers the blood of women to be unclean.
That's really common, like worldwide.
Hence, the lads are separated from their mothers and any other female, so their blood won't be contaminated as they mature into adulthood. The semen drinking custom is in different stages. In the initial stage, as soon as the young Sambia boys turn age 7 or 9, they're instantly taken from their mothers as a form of detachment. This is fucking wild shit.
I mean, there's a lot of crazy shit out there. I mean, they still have sort of as a mark of mourning if a family member dies, people cut off the tip of the finger. And so you get up into some of the more remote parts of the Highlands, you meet someone, you shake their hand, and they might have only sort of one full finger left.
Oh,
but it's also hard to tell because everyone's got these, 18-inch machete blades that they use for everything. I think some just get lost, sort of by mistake.
Right.
It's just the most. I mean, the country is so geographically broken. Like the terrain is so inhospitable, so hard to travel, that they've developed all these very, very quirky customs because all the tribes are in such isolation. I mean, their country has something like 750 languages.
Wow.
Although they nowadays communicate largely just with pidgin English, or pidgin as they call it, which is a sort of a broken English, kind of bastardized, simple English. But before that, the tribes, you might have one tribe that's living in one valley and 2 miles away in another valley for hundreds of years there's another tribe and they've never had any contact with each other. So they develop different languages, different customs, different faith, religions, everything. And it's like that across the country, particularly up in the Highlands. The river deltas are a bit different. But I mean, the Highlands are thought to be uninhabited until the 1930s. And then these Australian brothers, these gold prospectors, flew over the interior in a light aircraft for the first time. They looked down and they saw valleys with clear signs of habitation. So they mounted an expedition and over weeks marched up into the interior with dozens of porters. And they found about 1 million people living there. These just kind of lost Stone Age peoples. That most of them didn't know they were on an island with the coast on which people lived, let alone a huge world beyond that with all sorts of other people. One of the, well, actually, there were 3 Australian brothers. 2 of them ended up staying and living in PNG. One of them married 3, I think maybe sisters, but three women who were tribal princesses. And this is a sort of, let me get this right, an Irish emigre Australian gold prospector in the 30s who's from this massive outside interconnected world, suddenly going up and marrying people from a civilization that had no smelting, they just had stone tools, no writing, no literature. And that one of those marriages had several children. I met one of those guys, this guy who's the product of the son of these 2 totally disparate worlds, this kind of clash of civilizations, which I found so interesting.
What was he like?
He was great. Bernie, a really nice guy. He's kind of he manages a coffee plantation in a town called Hagen up in the Highlands. Really sound dude. I got to hang out with him a bit, got to know him well, and he's just a nice, sort of normal guy. I suppose because his mother was a princess, he's sort of kind of senior within the tribe, but at the same time, kind of half foreigner and half outsider. So he's sort of between the 2 worlds as well.
Do you still have contact with his father?
His father had passed away. There's a really good documentary called First Contact, 80s documentary. It's on YouTube. It's part of a trilogy, Black Harvest trilogy. But First Contact is interviews with these 3 brothers, by which point they're already quite old. But on their first encounter getting up into the Highlands, these people they met, there's footage, there's photos from this unique encounter in the 1930s. Really, really interesting.
This is not the same place where there's a tribe there where they have they've made models of airplanes that they worship.
The cargo cults, those I believe. I mean, it's that part of the world. I don't think it's Papua New Guinea. It could be potentially part of some of the Solomon Islands. It might be some small Filipino islands. I'm not entirely sure. I know what you mean. And yeah, they would see these planes and think that they were gods. And
so
then
they've recreated them. They've recreated them out of like sticks. And
they had like bamboo radio control towers and like bamboo radios that obviously don't work with bamboos. They had but I read about that a long time ago. I can't remember the details that well. But yeah, that was pretty cool.
How fascinating that in the 1930s they were able to find these Stone Age tribes there.
Well, it makes you think. I mean, there are still rumours that in Papua New Guinea there might still be uncontacted tribes. Like in the Amazon, there's still like a few dozen uncontacted tribes. But I believe most of them sort of know there's a world out there, but Brazilian, largely government, sort of protects them and keeps them in isolation as much as anything because they're just vulnerable to disease, perhaps. But then the one, I think the most astounding kind of lost tribe is the North Sentinelese.
Yeah,
You're aware of these
sure.
guys, yeah. And every now and again someone marches
That's
out
where
with
the
Bible
missionary.
and,
Yeah.
yeah.
Do you know who Commander Maurice Vidal Portman is?
No.
This is a famous British explorer / pervert who went to visit those people, and he's probably responsible for their hostility towards outsiders in a lot of ways. Because this guy would go there and dress them up in weird outfits and measure their dicks and shit. And
That was North Sentinel.
yeah. Well,
Are there pictures of this?
He was on neighboring islands, but I mean, I think they got wind of this character. Yeah, there's pictures of him, and there's pictures of natives dressed up like Roman soldiers and stuff. He would do weird shit with them, and he would comment on the size of their penises and testicles, so he's like measuring them and stuff. And he was clearly some fucking weirdo who was involved in some very strange shit, and he was doing it, under the auspices of science and exploration. Yeah, but I think he's one of the reasons why I think that the most recent missionary got murdered.
Right.
Because they probably they don't have a written language, so they probably have these oral stories and these legends of these white dudes who show up and start measuring dicks and give everybody the flu.
Yeah, well, I think there's only a few dozen of them. And after the big tsunami back in 2003, 2002, 2003, after that, it was years before there were any signs of them seen again. So potentially they, came close to destruction.
Yeah, there's been a few boats that have been stranded nearby and have barely gotten away before these people murdered them.
Arrows and spears.
Yeah, well, there's only 39 of them that they've documented. They don't know how many there are there. They don't even think they have fire.
They've got to have fire.
I don't know. I think there's some dispute as to whether or not they have fire.
Well.
Because how wet is their climate? I don't know. They do know that they have metal now. They seem to have fashioned knives and swords from the wreckage of one of the ships.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that'd be interesting. I mean, I have no intentions of marching in there.
Well, it's just crazy. It's wild. Uncontacted people in this day and age is very strange. I mean, there's semi-contacted people in the Amazon, and it's just it's so interesting because you get essentially a window into 60,000 years ago with the people in North Sentinel Island. The people that live there, the direct descendants of people who left Africa 60,000 years ago, landed on that island.
Yeah, there's interesting sort of, because of the sort of exodus is the wrong word, I guess, but the migrations out of Africa came in waves. And some of the early people seem to have, with their wave of migration, headed all the way up, over, around, down, and into Melanesia. So the Aborigines and New Guineans are from a very, very ancient wave of migration. And everyone else who came a lot later, but these people had already inhabited these, well, I guess the two islands were one continent in that time, the sea levels were lower. But they'd already sort of started existing in total isolation. But I mean, the numbers get disputed because they keep finding more things that pushes back the timeline. But now they're looking, it was for ages 40,000 years, now they're looking at sort of 60 to 80,000 years, just living, totally isolated, while, the rest of the world was, I suppose, a more interconnected, human trade networks very quickly brought corners of the world into connection. I mean, it's only about 12, 15,000 years ago that people crossed the Bering Strait to the Americas, and the Americas were populated. I mean, that's... it's kind of a blink of an eye compared to 80,000.
Well, I think people were here before that then now they're pushing the timeline back of human beings in North America, which is really interesting. They're finding a lot of pre-Clovis evidence of civilizations, with stone tools and all sorts of other things, and fossilized remains.
I read a book by someone who you had on this podcast a while ago, whose name I'm going to forget, but you had him on with Randall Carlson one time, and he's got...
Graham Hancock?
Graham Hancock, exactly. Yeah. And, I mean, some of his theories seemed a little tenuous, but some of them are fascinating, like evidence of civilizations being in places, tens of thousands of years before anyone else thought. And I mean, it was through that podcast record that I was first introduced to Göbekli Tepe, and it's incredible how, I guess, with new archaeological techniques, new scanning, new LiDAR, just the books are being totally rewritten on a kind of yearly basis. Yeah, well,
they're all a proponent now of the two of those guys together is a really fascinating combination, because they're proponents of the Younger Dryas impact theory, and there's a lot of physical evidence that points to that. And what that Younger Dryas impact theory is that there was a certain time somewhere between, there's multiple times, but it started around 12,000 years ago. There was impacts, and the impacts from asteroid impacts
reversed an ice age, or
caused an ice age, stopped the ice age. It killed the ice age, and probably did it very quickly. And the impacts, Randall Carlson has some really fascinating physical evidence that points to it. First of all, core samples. When they go to core samples and they go to 12,000 years ago, there's a direct evidence of iridium, large amounts of iridium, which is very common in space and very rare on Earth. Also, nuclear blast. Trinitite, I think it's called, and it's named after the Trinity, the first nuclear bomb experiments, and that they detect this glass that happens when they detonate a nuclear bomb, but also happens on impacts of comets and asteroids, and that this stuff is all over the place at
So
that
like
same
obsidian, that kind of.
yes. And this stuff is all, it's sort of like that, but it's directly caused by energy. But this stuff all exists in this time period of 12,000 years ago. And then again, somewhere, they believe somewhere around 11 or 10,000 years ago. So most likely what they're supposing, what the theory is that there was probably a very advanced civilization that created things like Göbekli Tepe, and there's even some theories about the old kingdom of Egypt, that there was some very sophisticated architecture and construction methods that date back far beyond what we think of when we think of the Great Pyramid of Giza. They believe is 2,500 years old, but he thinks that it's very possible that was even earlier than that. And there's also some physical evidence that was uncovered by geologist Robert Schoch, from Boston University, where he points to the water erosion around the Temple of the Sphinx that shows signs of thousands of years of rainfall.
I remember that.
Yeah, and the problem with that is the last time there was real rainfall in the Nile Valley was 9,000 years ago. And that the whole area back then used to be a rainforest. And that, so he's like, you have to go at least that far back, but probably thousands of years before that, because you need thousands of years of rainfall to develop these deep fissures in the stone structure. That they don't indicate erosion by sand and wind. The problem is archaeologists and people who have been teaching in universities and writing books about the history of these people are very reluctant to accept this new information, even though it's like, when you're talking about geology, when you're talking about like clear evidence of water erosion, like this is like rock solid stuff. This is not like
there's like a knock-on effect as well. I suppose if you admit that one thing is significantly older or was formed in a different way or in a different place to something else, then that just knocks everything else out of whack, and you basically start your entire archaeological process again, which I guess is why you get wrongly, because that's not the scientific method, but you get resistance to these new ideas.
It's very unfortunate when you see the resistance too, because it's so clearly ego-based. I've seen people argue against it, and they get really angry and they start insulting and ad hominems, and it's really weird, because the one that you can't fuck with is Göbekli Tepe, because Göbekli Tepe was purposely covered somewhere in the neighborhood of 12,000 years ago, and they know that for a fact. They've tested all the soil around it, and they're in the middle of excavating that site, and it's an immense site with these enormous stone columns and 3D animals carved on the columns, which indicate that they weren't carved into the columns. The columns were carved around to create these 3D animals, which is really sophisticated stuff, and it's more than 12,000 years old. It was covered up.
It was like a deliberate time capsule to preserve.
They don't know.
I think that was Graham's theory.
Yeah, it's his theory,
like
but
to preserve, in the the whole, the antediluvian, the flood myth that seems to, or story at least, that seems to be in so many different cultures.
Yeah.
But I think that ties in with Randall's idea of a huge wave of floods and the ice age.
Yes.
Stopping. Yeah.
Well, that ending of the ice age, one of the things that they point to is the geological evidence all over North America that seem to indicate massive amounts of water moving through areas radically and quickly, changing the landscape. And Randall has some really incredible evidence of that he shows in the form of slides. And as you zoom out and you see the water evidence, it's really interesting stuff, because we have this inclination to look at history. Okay, we've got that down. We've got it. This is it. And then upon new evidence, instead of like going, oh, maybe we were wrong, they just dig their heels in and they say, no, I wrote a book on this. I made my thesis about this. This is fact.
Well, I think that's exactly the same. Even with modern human history, we're really resistant to kind of think that the way there's the last few years, a lot in Britain. I don't know how much about in the US, but there's been a big discussion about how we view and teach our history, of the British Empire, for example, of colonialism. Because when I was growing up, we were taught that Britain conquered the world and brought civilization to all the, the noble savages, and it was totally insane. And it's only just about now, and particularly some or 2 years ago, with the debate about statues and should we really learn our history from statues, or should we learn it from books and reassessing facts? And should we have statues commemorating people who maybe did horrific things? But all these these sort of arguments, debates, and essentially culture war has brought to the fore this idea of we definitely need to sometimes reassess history, and that can work both ways as well. But history isn't fact, whether it's the history of a landscape over tens of thousands of years or the history of a people over a century. And I think that's tying it neatly back in. That's what I find interesting with Russia, because Russia is able to recreate as convenient its history every 10 years or so in a cynical way, admittedly. But it shows that history is not a fixed, determinate thing.
Well, it's unfortunate we don't have like a real rock solid history of the world. We have some really amazing evidence, and some incredible work has been done by archaeologists and geologists and all these people that are trying to get a sense of it. But there's resistance to change. There's a resistance to accepting these alternative theories.
Well, can you imagine trying to be a historian 200 or 300 years from now, looking at this era, the amount of information that you have to sift through?
Right.
Some of which is bullshit. Some of which is, all of it will contradict each other. I mean,
Right.
that's a headache. That task. History is only going to get harder because there's just a complete preponderance of information.
There's a preponderance of information, but at least we have information.
We have accurate
Right.
footage, but that was only a short period that's now ending because now we don't know if footage is real.
Right.
There's all sorts.
Right.
The age of kind of, I suppose, empirical media is kind of on its way out. At least that you can be ensured is empirical, because from now on, who knows what's what.
What's also interesting when for a long time they had no idea what happened to the Mayans. And there was all these theories about them leaving, what happened, and now the predominant theory is they were killed by disease. Yeah, which makes more sense than anything.
Well, I think it's now believed that after Europeans first arrived in the Americas, within 100 years, 90% of the population had died.
Yes,
which is
from
astounding.
disease.
And
yes.
they're only just now starting to find these traces of vast civilizations in the Amazon. I'm sure there'll be many more to come. There are rock paintings appearing. There are, in one particular point, evidence of sort of ramps up from the Amazon on one side of the river and then down on the other. Bridges that would have spanned hundreds of meters. Huge, kind of complex and quite advanced civilizations that just in a jungle, if everyone dies, and grow over no time at all. And it seems like a lot of people might have turned to a hunter-gathering subsistence life in the jungle from that. Because if there's a plague, plagues are usually in sort of pre-scientific times, and even perhaps today, are viewed by a lot of people as divine retribution, punishments, and fleeing the system of pets back into the wild. I'm sure plenty of people saw COVID at that for some time as well.
It was a lot worse than COVID, smallpox. But the other thing is the LiDAR evidence. Have you seen that stuff that they're using?
Is this the big ring? Cities were built in big circular shapes.
Not just that, but grids that indicate irrigation in blocks of cities. And Graham Hancock talked about that as well on the podcast. And there's a great video that's available on YouTube who discusses the potential population of the Amazon reaching as much as 20 million people at one point in time. But there's vast cities there. Did you also know that the Amazon itself was created by agriculture? That all that rainforest, most of those trees were a direct result of different trees and different plants that people planted when there was a civilization.
So it had been savanna or pampas or something? Or?
Well, it was just different. They're not exactly sure what it... They used to think it was all natural, and now they don't think it's natural. Go, please pull up something about that. Now that there's direct evidence... Here it goes. While previously thought to have been an empty wilderness in pre-contact times, it has become increasingly clear that the Amazon has, first, a deep and ancient pattern of human settlement dating back to 12,000 years ago, and second, that much of the Amazon jungle that we know today is, in fact, an anthropogenic... If you just click on that, there's actually better articles that detail it. Okay, here it goes. While previously thought to have been an empty wilderness, the Amazon infers a deep and ancient pattern. Second, that much of the Amazon jungle we know is in fact an anthropogenic landscape. That is, the Amazon has been modified extensively by indigenous populations for the past 12,000 years. The changes that the indigenous populations made in the Amazon rainforest in the past were nowhere near the level of intensive extraction we see going on in the massive deforestation burning today. Rather, indigenous populations increase the overall biodiversity and quality of the soil. This is not what I'm looking for. There's a better article that shows that most of the trees in the Amazon were a result of agriculture.
So that was sort of creating ecological diversity.
And then when people died, it just overran.
Yeah.
And it overwhelmed what used to be these cities. That's the whole Legend of the Lost City of Z, right? That book?
Yeah, I
In the
read
film
that. It was great.
There it is. Supposedly pristine, untouched Amazon rainforest was actually shaped by humans. Over thousands of years, native people play a strong role in molding the ecology of this vast wilderness. And this is from the Smithsonian, so it's a legitimate source, but there's a bunch of different trees that they point to that these people planted, and then these trees just overwhelmed the landscape when all the people died off from the plague, and when they're using the LiDAR to go over these areas that they used to assume were just mounds, they realize, no, this used to be structures, and there used to be people living there.
That's fascinating.
Wild stuff, man. Well, listen, Charlie, I'm glad you're alive. I'm glad you're not in a Russian prison. And I'm glad I had a chance to talk to you. And these books that you have out that are available right now, one is on Roads That Echo, and the other is Through Sand and Snow. Did you do an audio version of these as well?
Yeah, they're both on Audible.
Did you
Kindle.
read it?
I read it.
Oh, excellent. Love hearing that.
Yeah, no, they're out. Get hold of them. But thank you so much for having
My
me
pleasure.
on. It's been a lot of fun, and thanks to Jamie and you for having me here. It's been awesome.
Our pleasure. Thank you very much for coming. And do you have social media that people can find you on as well?
Yeah, I'm on Instagram and Twitter at CW Explore. CW Explore.
Explore. There it is right there. CW Explore.
And my website is cwexplore.com. Check it out. That's where I post most of my stuff. And I don't know what will be next yet, but that's the place to follow it.
Well, when you come up with another one, let us know, and I'd love to sit down and do this again.
That'd be a pleasure.
And stay out of jail, buddy. Please. Thank you, Charlie.
Cheers.
All right, bye, everybody.
When you think about the new wave of guitar and instrumental music, the biggest name that is sure to ring a bell is Polyphia. Not only has Polyphia solidified their position as one of the most influential progressive Christian rock bands of the decade, but they portray an image that is synonymous to that of successful rappers. Their I don't give a fuck attitude, distinctive poise, and sheer authenticity has been their greatest asset.
Right? I would say I like mine a little bit better than yours, but
that's funny because I would go as far to say that I think mine's just flat out better.
Polyphia managed to single-handedly shift the tides of progressive music while also being one of the most controversial bands on the internet. How did they do it? How did the guys go from contentious underdogs to mainstream celebrities? In order to understand Polyphia's immense success, we have to address their incredible backstory and how they became the Polyphia we all know today. I hope all of you guys are doing well today. I'm guitarist and producer Mon Floral, and today we're going to be talking about the extraordinary instrumental band that is Polyphia. In 2010, the band Polyphia was formed in Plano, Texas, with the original members being Tim Henson and Scott LePage as the guitarist, Clay Gober as the bassist, and Brandon Buckhalter as the drummer, who left in 2014 to be replaced by Clay Ashleman. The name Polyphia is a playoff of the word polyphony, which is essentially harmonizing layers of individual melodies. It's a pretty cool sounding name, but it also accurately represents their sound, which involves layers upon layers of technical progressions. Starting off as a high school progressive metal band, the boys were eventually faced with the dilemma between furthering their education by going to college or taking the risk to pursue music. In an interview with Nebula Music Podcast, Tim Henson talks about how he dropped out of school at UNT in order to work in graphic design, only to realize that he hated the 9-to-5 job structure.
I just lied to my parents. I was like, yeah, I'm working and I'm in school. But when I quit that job, I came home that day and I told my dad, like, hey, I'm not in school and I just quit my job because we're about to ask the internet for $30,000.
During this time, Polyphia had already built a small following, which can be attributed to the release of their 2013 EP, Inspire, that was accompanied by their single Envision featuring Rick Graham. In the early days, they took a shot at touring, but soon realized that they were better off working to become internet stars. The music group truly hustled in the beginning to grow their brand and fan base, doing everything from going door to door selling tickets to their shows, and even paying to play at venues.
In the early days, a lot. We tried really hard. We tried too hard. We were tryhards about it.
Okay. In the beginning, the band's marketing tactic was essentially made up of just being the absolute worst band.
It's possible that we might be the worst people in history to ever get a signature guitar, as well as the signature pickups.
During this time, Polyphia was one of very few bands conducting the progressive guitar wave, and at one point were even looking to add a vocalist. Polyphia's bassist Clay touches on this in an interview with Austin Underground.
Looked at getting a vocalist. We were a lot smaller and our reach was not even near what it is, relatively speaking.
At the time, instrumental music wasn't like a big thing yet. Like Animals as Leaders was like the only one, and they like weren't on a wave yet, you know?
Although it may seem far-fetched today, it made sense why the band wanted to add vocals to their music. As they were gaining popularity, instrumental music was an incredibly small niche with very few successful bands in the genre. Animals as Leaders and Aaron Marshall of Intervals were really the only significant groups cultivating the new sound of instrumental guitar. Periphery was fairly large during this time as well, but since they had a vocalist, we can't necessarily count them, even though Misha Mansour's guitar playing was along a similar style. Not having a vocalist really limited Polyphia's opportunity, and even after their skill was acknowledged by Sumerian Records, they still had a hurdle to cross.
We're gonna tell our label about you, and Sumerian was like our dream label at the time. And so it was like, oh my God, this is it, this is our big break. They sent us an email, and the only thing that it said, with no punctuation or anything, was where's the vocalist?
Despite how difficult it was to grow without a vocalist, the band stayed true to their sound and continued to just make the music they enjoyed making, which I'm sure all of us can appreciate today. In 2014, Polyphia released their debut album, Muse, which was funded by an online Indiegogo campaign. The release of Muse put Polyphia on the map with features from large names such as Aaron Marshall, Jason Richardson, and even Sean's Mario Camarena and Eric Hansel. The album itself was amazing, and as a 15-year-old during this time also making instrumental music, the album really resonated with me. But the song that really sold Polyphia was Champagne, which featured Nick Johnston. The song racked up millions of views throughout the first few years of its release and showed the world what they were really capable of. Combining good music with a good music video was a simple yet effective recipe for the group to acquire recognition. Polyphia was gaining appraisal with an online presence that was both adored and despised. The band was making meaningful progress, but there was still work to be done. The release of the Renaissance album in 2016 completely shifted the way Polyphia was perceived. The album was a catalyst that fused elements from numerous genres, driving Polyphia down a road that made their music more appealing to listeners outside of the
Minions have spawned. First blood. slain. An enemy has been slain. An enemy has been slain. has been slain. An ally has been slain.
metal/rock genre. The boys are moving away from guitar shredding and began focusing on song structures that entailed choruses with memorable hooks. Instead of cramming as many notes as possible into a 3-minute, 150 BPM timeline, they made each note count, making exceptional use of whammy bar flutters and variations of guitar sliding techniques. While many of these methods were used in their early music, they were not as prevalent in the foundation of their songs. In the Renaissance album, Polyphia started to experiment with combining hip-hop style productions with melodic guitars. And after realizing that they were onto something, they took it even further in their single Lid, which was a heavily remixed EDM hip-hop version of the song Light. Now, this was the point where there was a huge divide across Polyphia's fanbase. While some fans were crazy about this new sound Polyphia was bringing to light, others wanted them to stay true to their original rock-oriented style. Regardless of who was rocking with it, the fans were talking, and the release of the most hated EP was an ode to those who did not take a liking to the route Polyphia was going down. This EP was something fresh that meshed more genres than I can count in a manner that was virtually unheard of during this time. The EP had more hooks than a professional Fisher's tackle box, and honestly got better the more you listened to it. At this point, Polyphia was an acclaimed sensation that was crushing the internet, gaining recognition from nearly every direction, placing number 8 in Guitar World's Best Guitarist of the Decade, and Tim was being interviewed by everyone.
Like, the guitar is a means to an end. The end is music. Right.
Including the needle drops, Anthony
Like,
Fantano.
when anybody calls us anything, you know what I mean? I wouldn't call it math rock.
They were killing the game, and it was clear that they were taking over as one of the faces of instrumental guitar music. What made them stand out even more from other bands was their personality outside of their music.
I didn't see you there. We're in New York City right now.
They weren't overly introverted like some other guitarists.
What about you, Eric?
I don't know, I guess you could like...
They were young, loved to party, and always kept it casual, never afraid to be themselves. Fast forwarding to Polyphia's recent achievements, the band has managed to grow an insane fan base and are arguably more relevant than the bands who were around way before them. Tim and Scott both have their own signature Ibanez guitars along with DiMarzio pickups, plus have even performed alongside guitar legends Steve Vai, Joel Satriani, and Paul Gilbert. On top of that, Tim has even earned the #1 spot on Steve Vai's list of top guitarists. Every music video Polyphia drops attracts millions of views, and it's no surprise. A contributing factor to their success is their genre fluidity,
so that we don't end up sounding like anything in our genre,
which makes them more attractive to people who aren't into heavy instrumental music. As long as you have some appreciation for guitar-based instrumentals, Polyphia is likely to have at least one song that you'll enjoy. While their music is technical, most of it is easy on the ears and accented by easy-to-follow melodies. They pretty much created their own distinct Polyphia style. 2018 was one of the most successful years for Polyphia with the release of Go, which took the internet by an absolute storm and built substantial hype for their New Levels, New Devils album. They began integrating a dark tone into their sound, emphasizing the use of the harmonic minor scale. Their music was mesmerizing, and they were attracting the fan base of similar artists, like Yvette Young's band Covet and even Achika's fan base. Polyphia became very much self-aware of their status and even poked at it in the Look But Don't Touch music video. Tim is even featured on tracks by more mainstream artists such as Black Bear and Young Bands. Seeing a guitarist achieve a reach and fan base on par with rappers and singers is pretty out of the ordinary, but Tim and Polyphia managed to get their foot through that door. They've worked with some of the biggest hip-hop producers, including Y2K, who they share a close relationship with, Judge, who produces for Migos and Young Thug, as well as Lo-File, who is a Grammy-winning producer. Today, Polyphia is essentially a household name with a loyal following and little need to actively market their music. With the recent release of Playing God and an album 4 coming soon, Polyphia has lined themselves up to be the biggest instrumental band in the world. Fans are on the edge of their seats, shows are nearly selling out, and their haters are plotting a downfall that is unlikely to arrive anytime soon. I've been following this band for nearly 8 years now, and I can say without a doubt they've come an incredibly long way. I'd love to hear your thoughts on Polyphia down in the comments. Thanks for watching, and I will see you guys next time.
An enemy